subscribe and click the bell icon to turn on notifications.
We've made the accompanying exercise files for this tutorial available for free. Just click the link below in the video details to get these.
In this section, we're going to finally get to creating a drawing. And on the basis of the drawing that we're starting in this section, I'm going to set you exercise 1 in the next section. The drawing we're going to create is an office layout. And it's a very straightforward drawing to begin with. But not only are you going to see the basics of creating a drawing, but I'm going to start to introduce you to some of the correct terminology to use when you're working with Visio. So some of the words and phrases that I've used briefly so far, I'm going to explain more fully. So first of all, we're going to create our office layout drawing. I'm going to talk to you about pages and the shapes window. Then we'll look at adding shapes to a drawing and then doing various things to those shapes, such as resizing them and rotating them. And finally, I'll talk briefly about Visio templates. So let me start with a couple of things that you know how to do already. I'm going to create a new drawing. Now in doing this, I'm going to use one of the available templates here, and it's the office layout template. If for any reason you can't locate that, don't forget you can use the search facility, but it's the office layout template that you want. I'm going to use US units. It's up to you. If you prefer to use metric units throughout, that's fine. What I do won't largely depend very specifically on units. One or two places it will be helpful if you're on the same units as me, but for the purposes of this you can choose. So then I just click on Create. It downloads the template if necessary. And my office layout diagram is created. Now initially it has no shapes on it whatsoever, and we'll start by adding some shapes in just a moment. But before we do, let's save it. So into Backstage View, Save As. I've pinned my course files folder, as you may remember, so that's the folder I'm going for. And I'm going to call this Office Layout 01. Note the Save As type, Visio Drawing, the default. Note the drop down here as well, where I could choose one of these other many available formats, including Visio Macro Enabled Drawing and Visio 2003 to 2010 Drawing, if I needed either of the formats I discussed earlier, but I didn't have them set as my default. Click on Save. And my drawing is now saved. A Visio drawing can have many pages, and although the early drawings that we're doing will generally only have one, you may soon get to the point where you need multi-page drawings. In the case of an office layout, for example, you may want to do a drawing for each of the offices on the floor of a building, or maybe you want a number of different views of an office. If you were doing a layout for your own home, for example, you may have one page of a drawing for each room in the house. Alternatively, of course, you can do them as separate drawings, but very often having multiple pages is a good idea. Usually, by default, but this does depend on the template, a drawing has one page, and indeed this drawing has one page. If I wanted a second page for this drawing, there's a little plus sign down there, and that gives me a second page. I can switch between the two pages, and I can work on either or both pages, and when I save the drawing, I'll be saving both pages. So on this occasion, I only want the one page. To delete a page, if I right click on it, click on Delete, that page has gone. Let's turn our attention now to the panel on the left, which is called the Shapes window. And when you use a template to create a drawing, you get some content in this Shapes window. The Shapes window, by the way, can be collapsed to give it a little bit more space and expanded. But the content that you see in here is made up primarily of a number of stencils, and each stencil contains what are called masters. In the case of the office layout drawing, what I've got is a number of stencils. So for instance, walls, doors and windows is one of the stencils, and within that walls, doors and windows stencil there are a number of masters. There's a room master, an L room master, a T room master, and so on. Now with each of these masters I can use it to put a shape on my drawing. Let me click on the room master and drag it onto my drawing. A master, once it's been put onto a drawing, is known as a shape. So a template will include a number of stencils. Stencils include masters, and when we use masters in a drawing, the individual instances of a master are known as shapes. What you've seen now is one of the most basic ways of adding a shape to a drawing, just to drag the master over to make it a shape in the drawing. And you may have noticed when I did that the dimensions of the room appeared. They were in US units, of course. Don't worry about dimensions at the moment. We'll come back to that a little bit later on. But let's suppose now I want to put another shape on this drawing. Let's suppose I want to put a window in the wall. All I need to do is to drag the master onto the drawing and position it where I want that to be. Now in the case of a window, I'm going to need to put that on a wall. So let me drag the window master. Now watch what happens as I drag this onto the drawing. I'm going to drag it over the wall. And once I've got it onto the wall, Visio is intelligent enough to realize where to put it. Now you may have noticed that little message there, glue to geometry. One of the key skills you're going to need to learn with Visio is the ability to glue one thing to another thing. But at the moment I'm just going to drop this window onto this wall, and Visio takes its best guess at positioning this window in the wall. It knows the window will be inside the wall, not outside it or something, so it's actually lined it up very neatly with the wall. If I wanted a door, do the same sort of thing. Put it over here. I've now got a door going into the room as well. So that's the most basic way of adding shapes to a drawing. If I want to remove a shape from a drawing, if I click on the shape to select it, you notice the little selection handles that I've got on there. I can just click the delete key and that shape is removed. Let me just put that door back again. So far we've been adding shapes from the walls, doors and windows stencil, and that's the one that's selected in the shapes window. But if I were to select office furniture instead, I'd have a completely different set of masters to choose from. And on this occasion I'm going to put a table within the office. I'm going to put a boat-shaped table right in the middle there. Now that's rather a big table, but never mind. And again, exactly the same principles apply. We just drag the master onto the drawing. As we start to build up the layout of the office, we may well decide that we need to make changes to the shapes that we've already put on the drawing. For instance, looking at that table, that's far too big to go in that office. So if I wanted to make it smaller, there are several ways of doing it. I can do it very precisely, as you'll see later. But one very simple way of doing it is to use the sizing handles whilst the table is selected, and I can change the size of the table using the sizing handles. That's normal with sizing handles. If I use a corner one, it keeps the aspect ratio. If I wanted to make it thinner, I could use one of the side handles, etc. So having made it a little bit more of a reasonable size, another thing I can do very easily is to rotate it. I might decide that I really need to have it, if you like, pointing the other way. Many shapes have a rotation handle like this, and I can rotate the shape. More about rotation later, but having rotated it, if I then want to move it, hover over until I get the four-headed arrow, and then I can drag it into place. Notice the little dashed lines. They're going to center it within the room. Aligning and arranging shapes, again, is a topic we'll look at later on, but there are very simple indicators like this to give you a very quick way of positioning shapes in a drawing. So there's my boat shape table. If I decide that after all that I don't really want a boat shape table, I prefer a different shape, one of the controls that I briefly mentioned earlier on is the change shape control on the home tab. And if I click on change shape, it gives me a gallery of alternative shapes for the ones that I've currently got selected. And if I click up here on the drop down, it lets me choose from the available stencils. So if I go back to the office furniture stencil, I could, for example, decide, well, what I really want is a round table in there. This is currently elliptical, but I can maybe make it a little bit rounder. Not quite round, but I may prefer that table after all. Finally, in this section, I'd just like to talk a little about templates. I've already mentioned that a template can contain one or more stencils. It can also contain one or more drawing pages, and there may well be content already in one or more of those pages. A template will normally have the measurement units defined, and there can even be bespoke software associated with a template. It can come with its own macro code that's used for a purpose which is specific to that template. In fact, templates can be very complex. Some templates can have all of those things in them. We'll be using some more templates later on in the course, but for now, that's the end of this section. I'll see you in the next one. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Visio 2016. It's time now for you to do exercise 1, and as with exercises in general, my solution is in the exercise files folder. Exercise 1 shows an L-shaped office with a couple of windows, one of which is quite a big sort of picture window. In that office there's some corner furniture, a little sort of corner desk and a couple of cupboards. 2 people work in the office. Each of them has a desk with a lamp on it. Each of them has a waste bin. There are some small office plants around the corner of the L-shaped office. And next to one of the desks there is a coat rack. Next to the other desk there is a whiteboard, a marker board on the wall. So don't worry too much about getting exactly the same size as me, not even exactly the same layout. Just get used to adding the shapes, moving them around, rotating them, resizing them as necessary, and of course deleting them if you decide you don't need something. The other thing you may need to just experiment with is getting those doors to open left to right or right to left, in and out as you require. And I suggest with that you look to the context menus for that sort of thing when you're dealing with doors. That's exercise 1. I'll see you in the next section. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Visio 2016. Throughout this course we're going to be creating new diagrams several times. And traditionally in Visio, when you create a diagram, you tend to get an empty drawing, some stencils, various other resources, some of which we've looked at already and some of which we'll be looking at in the balance of the course. But basically, you sort of start from scratch with a drawing. In 2016, a new range of starter diagrams have been introduced. And these starter diagrams give you a much fuller starting point for a diagram, not only giving you some initial shapes, but also some helpful tips on building the type of drawing that you're intending to draw. So in this section I'm going to introduce you to starter diagrams and a couple of examples. One example that it's included with all editions of Visio 2016, and one of the examples that's included with just the professional edition. As an example of a very straightforward drawing, suppose I was going to make a new basic flowchart. If I click on basic flowchart here, the top left option is, if you like, the traditional option for creating a new drawing. It's an empty drawing. If I click on that, click on create, I finish up with some stencils and a completely empty drawing. On the other hand, if if I go to basic flowchart and click on one of the other options, each of these is a starter diagram. So that one is vertical flowchart, that one is decision branches flowchart, and this one is on-page reference flowchart. Each of those illustrates one or more specific aspects of using Visio. And if I click on, say, that one and click on Create, I get a starter diagram with already some shapes on it. Of course, I can change that at will. But I also get this pane here, the tips pane. And the tips pane gives you tips on using that particular drawing. So typically, theme. Color can add clarity and elegance. Pick a theme from the Design tab. So if you go to the Design tab, there's the gallery of themes. You can choose a theme for your drawing. Next tip, drag drop. To put a shape between two connected shapes, drag it onto the connector between them. So for instance, I could take a process shape from the shapes window on the left, drop it between a couple of shapes that are already on the diagram, and it'll be inserted between them. The next tip is about sub-process and so on. So apart from the initial shapes and the initial version of the drawing, you've got a range of tips that are relevant to that particular type of drawing. Not all of these templates have starter diagrams with them, but many of them do. And apart from flowcharts, which you've seen already, if you go to Basic Network Diagram, you have the empty default, but you also have an option of a basic home network. And we're going to be using an example of a basic home network several times throughout this course, although not based on this particular starter diagram. But then we also have a small medium business network. Click on Create, and I have both a starter diagram with several shapes in it already and a number of tips: add shape, auto align and space, and so on. So that's one of the basic examples. As far as Visio Professional is concerned, if we go to the BPMN diagrams, again the top left one in the set there is the blank. But for BPMN, or Business Process Model and Notation in general, I have process with gateway, for example, process with multiple roles, address change process. And again, click on Create. And again, I have a starter diagram and a set of tips. With all of the sets of tips, when you've finished using them, if you select the pane that the tips are in, all you need to do then, press the delete key, the tips are gone, and you have the full drawing window space available as well. So that's starter diagrams in Visio 2016. I'll see you in the next section. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Visio 2016. In this and the next few sections, we're going to look at the Visio workspace in more detail. And in this particular section, we're going to take a closer look at the Shapes window and some of the features and functionality associated with it. Hopefully you were successful in completing exercise 1 and you have your first Visio drawing. You may well have had a couple of problems with it. For instance, you may have found it difficult to line everything up neatly, or you may have had trouble, for example, getting the lamps on top of the desks instead of the desks on top of the lamps. There are all sorts of things about using Visio and adding shapes, moving them around and so on that we still need to cover. But it's very important that you understand many features of the workspace first. And that's why we're turning our attention to the workspace now. So first of all, we're going to look again at minimizing the Shapes window and how you can actually use it in minimized form. We're going to look at the relationship between drawings and templates. We're going to look at quick shapes, at favorites, and finally I'm going to show you shape data. As you use Visio more, and particularly if you're going to be using it to draw large and complex diagrams, it increasingly becomes a requirement to have as much space to work in as possible. And being able to do something like minimize the Shapes window can give you a considerable amount of extra space. Now you may think from what you've seen already that you can only use the shapes window if it's fully maximized, if it's fully visible as it is on the left there, but that's not the case. Note that the Office Accessories stencil is currently selected. If I minimize the shapes window, it takes up a lot less space, but note the Office Accessories, all of the masters that are in that stencil, are still displayed, but they're displayed one above the other in this minimized shapes window on the left. And I can actually scroll up and down that window. There's arrows there to take me down to the bottom, up to the top, to scroll through the available masters to choose the one that I want. And above those masters there's a little control with a little arrow to the right. Click on that, and that lets me switch stencils. So I don't even have to maximize the shapes window to select a new stencil. I can just go, for example, for Office Equipment, and now I can see the masters in the Office Equipment stencil. Let me just maximize it again. I want to now make a very important point about drawings and templates. I mentioned earlier on in the course that a template will normally include one or more stencils, but strictly speaking that's not really quite how it works. What happens when you use a particular template is that a selection of stencils may be enabled by that template. But in fact, when you're doing a drawing, all of the standard Visio stencils are available to you. They may just not be visible. And in fact, if I wanted to draw an office layout, I could take a completely different template, one for something completely unrelated to that, say some sort of software network diagram or something like that, and I could still draw the office layout. All I would need to do is to enable the stencils that I need to do the drawing. So let me just show you how this works in this particular case. You notice that we have a selection of stencils: cubicles, Office Accessories, Office Equipment, etc. Those 5 stencils are what might loosely be called the 5 that go with the particular template, the Office Layout template that we used for this particular drawing. But if I go up to the More Shapes button here, click on that, and then go to Maps and Floor Plans, and then choose Building Plan, you'll see a list of all of the stencils that are available for building plans, and you can see that 4 of them are checked: cubicles, Office Accessories, Office Equipment, and Office Furniture. So those 4 are checked, and in fact if I scroll down to the bottom I'll see the 5th one: walls, doors and windows. So what this template actually does is to say that those 5 stencils need to be enabled when you use this template. But if I wanted plumbing as well, all I would need to do is to check on plumbing in the list, and now the plumbing stencil is available as well, and that includes things like boilers and radiators and toilets and so on. So the way that the templates work is perhaps not quite the way that you thought of at first, but it does make the important point that you can really access all of the stencils from just about any drawing that you're doing. Now if I want to stop using the plumbing stencil, all I need to do is to right click on plumbing, and one of the options there is closed, and that particular stencil is closed. And of course the same will be true of any stencil. There are some features of Visio 2016 that can be very useful in saving you time and effort, particularly if you're working on large complex diagrams. And one of them, which we're going to look at later on in the course, is the use of quick shapes. For each of the stencils there is a set of quick shapes, and these are the ones that are used most easily in some areas, particularly of automation in Visio. If you look at the walls, doors and windows stencil there, the top 4 items, room, wall, door, window, just below those there is a very, very thin grey line. And the shapes, the masters above that grey line, are called the quick shapes. If I go to Office Accessories, again you'll notice there's a little thin grey line below palm plant, large palm plant, marker board and desk lamp. So they are the 4 quick shapes for that stencil. If I want to change the quick shapes, it's pretty easy. So let's suppose that I want to make the round waste bin one of my quick shapes, all I need to do is to right click on round waste bin and click on add to quick shapes, and there it is. I can also move them around, so for instance if I wanted it to be the first quick shape, I could drag it into position. And if I wanted to add square waste bin, I can either use the same technique or I can just drag it up there. And to remove masters from the quick shapes, let's suppose I wanted to get rid of large palm plant, right click, there's an option remove from quick shapes. So you can adjust the quick shapes for any of the stencils in that way, and we'll be using quick shapes a little bit later on in the course. Something else that you can do which can be very useful is to create your own stencils, and you already have by default a stencil of your own called your favorite stencil. I'm not going to go into the creation of stencils now, but let's just look at favorites. Let's suppose that I've got 3 or 4 shapes, and maybe these shapes are shapes from different stencils, and I'd like them all to be easily accessible while I'm working on a particular drawing. So let's suppose that I want 2 completely different shapes, one from the office furniture stencil and one from the office equipment stencil. Let's say I want desk chair. If I right click and click on add to my shapes, I have a choice of adding it to my favorite stencil, which is what I'm going to do, but I can also add it to a new stencil. So I could create a new stencil with that master, that shape in it, or I could add it to an existing stencil. Now at this stage I'm just going to add it to favorites. So there it goes, it's in my favorite stencil. Now you can't see my favorite stencil at the moment, so if I go up to more shapes, my shapes, favorites, you'll see my favorite stencil there, and you'll see it's got desk chair in it. If I now go to say office equipment and decide that notebook PC is something else I'm going to be using quite a bit, and now you can see that in my favorites I have desk chair and notebook PC, which makes it very easy to use those 2 masters on any diagram without having to switch between those stencils. There's one other thing to point out about the shapes window while we're here. Given that I've already drawn the distinction between masters and shapes, you may say, why isn't the shapes window called the masters window? Well, I'm afraid it just is. It's just called the shapes window. It probably ought to be called the masters window, but like most people that use Visio, you'll probably find yourself using the terms interchangeably quite a bit anyway. Having seen how to minimize and maximize the shapes window, there's one other thing that's very useful to be able to do, and you might want to do this if you don't actually need to change the shapes on a drawing. You perhaps need to do a different sort of work on the drawing altogether. You can completely hide the shapes window. If you go to the View tab in the Show group, there is a Task Panes button, and if you click on the drop down, there is an option there to switch off the shapes window altogether. And that can give you a lot more width, a lot more space to work in. And in this particular show group, on that Task Panes button, there are some other panes, some task panes that you can show and hide. And we're going to be looking at these later on in the course, but let me just point one of them out now because you might find it useful. Shape Data. With the Shape Data pane, you get information about the currently selected shape. So for instance, I can see in US units the width and length of that desk, the one that's selected. And if I wanted, for example, to know something about this cupboard with the 2 drawers on the front, select that, and I now see the shape data for that. Shape data is one of the subjects we'll be covering in much more detail later on in the course, but in the meantime you may well find that useful when you're working on your early drawings. That's the end of this section. I'll see you in the next one. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Visio 2016. In this section we're going to continue looking at the Visio workspace, and we're going to look at the status bar. That bar right at the bottom of the window. In the case of Windows 10, it's the bottom of the Visio window, so it's above the Windows 10 taskbar. And if, as is the case at the moment, I don't have a drawing open, I may see little or nothing on the bar, and indeed there is just one thing down at the bottom right hand edge of the bar. Let me just hover over that, see the screen tip. It says switch windows. If I had more than one drawing open, I could switch windows to the other drawing using that button. Most of the other content will only appear if I have a drawing open. If you've used the status bar in other Office products, you might be able to skip this section, but it's quite a short section, and I am going to tell you one or two specific things about Visio, so it may be worth just working through it with me. Let me open a drawing next. When a drawing is open, quite a bit of additional content appears on that bar, and I'm going to talk about that content in detail in a moment. But first of all, if I hover the mouse over the bar and right click, you'll see a list of the potential contents of the status bar. And at the moment, every item in the list is ticked. So that means that in theory at least, I will see everything that I might be able to see on the status bar. However, whether I see certain things or not will depend on the situation. For instance, whether I have a shape selected. If you look at the first item in the list, page number, which is ticked, 1 of 1 it says on the right. If you look at the bottom left hand corner of the display, the left hand end of the status bar, indeed it says page 1 of 1. If I'm not interested in page numbers, I can disable that and I no longer see the page number there. On the other hand, with width, there's no sign of anything that might be a width on the status bar, and indeed if I uncheck that, I won't see any change in the status bar at all. And the reason is that I'll only see a width if I've got something selected which has a width. So for example, let me select that cupboard, that cabinet in my exercise 1 drawing. Once that's selected, if you look at the bottom left hand end of the status bar, you can see height. Let me right click on the status bar again and enable width, and now of course you can see width and height. So basically that's how the status bar works. You select what you want to be able to see, and whether or not you see any content for that particular piece of information will depend on the specific situation. Frankly, there's not a lot more to the status bar than that, but there are a couple of controls that I'd just like to mention because understanding them a little will probably help you. Still looking towards the left hand end of the status bar, one of the symbols there is this one, the one with the screen tip, no macros are currently recording. If you get into programming, to macro programming of Visio, you may well record the actions that you are taking so that you can repeat them, possibly with a bit of adaptation as well. We won't be covering macro recording on this course, but it's important to realize you can control macro recording from buttons on the status bar. And over on the right hand end of the status bar, most of these controls are to do with the current view. So for instance, I've already pointed out zoom control. But to the left of the zoom slider, there is a button that takes you from what's called maintenance mode in Visio. That is really where you're working on your drawings, you're developing, you're adding detail and so on, into what's called presentation mode. And if rather than people looking at your drawings and seeing a ribbon and a shapes window and all the other things, you for instance just want to show a drawing or a sequence of drawings on the screen without all the maintenance utilities and so on around, if you click on presentation mode, it takes you into a mode where you just see the drawing or drawings. And one way out of that is to hit the escape key. That takes you back into maintenance mode again. And another button which I have mentioned before but which is very conveniently placed down here on the status bar is the one to the right of the zoom controls. It's this one, fit page to current window. When you've been working on a drawing, perhaps zooming in, zooming out, adding shapes and so on, if you just want to put it back to a nicely fitted size, that's a good button to use. That can be very useful as well. So that's it, that's the basics of the status bar. I'll see you in the next section. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Visio 2016. In this section we're going to look at the dynamic grid. As you will already have seen, probably at least when you did exercise 1, positioning objects can be a little bit tricky, and sometimes you may want to do the positioning very accurately but possibly quite quickly as well. And the dynamic grid can definitely help with both of these. So first of all, I'm going to show you how to enable the dynamic grid, although to be fair it's probably already enabled on your installation of Visio 2016. Then we're going to look at using it for alignment. We'll use it for spacing, and finally we'll take a look at using it for resizing shapes. I could demonstrate the dynamic grid using one of the existing drawings, but let's start a brand new drawing. So I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut Control N to create a new drawing. As you will realize by now, of course, I don't get a nice load of stencils if I don't use a template, but I certainly know how to get any stencils that I need now. And what I'm going to do is to put some very simple shapes on this drawing and demonstrate the dynamic grid. I'll save the drawing to the course files folder, you don't need to see me do that. And having done that, I go to the View tab, and in the Visual Aids group here, make sure that Dynamic Grid is checked. What I'm going to demonstrate here will work with any shape really, but I'm going to use very simple shapes to demonstrate it. So I'm going to go to More Shapes, and I'm going to go to General, and we're going to get the Basic Shapes stencil. That has very simple shapes like circles and squares and things. I'm going to drag a circle onto the page. There it is. Now what I'm going to do is to take a square and also drag it onto the page. Now as I drag that square, watch carefully what happens, because as I get to a certain point, ignore that pair of arrows for the moment, but watch as I move across the circle. There we are. Now what you can see there, those dashed lines, are alignment lines. And basically what I can see there is that the rectangle is now left aligned with the circle and center aligned with the circle, and it's also right aligned. So the left, the center and the right are aligned. Let me just put that square back and make the circle a different size. Now let me drag the same square across and watch what happens. Ignore any of those double-headed arrows for the moment. Now notice now that it's left aligned. It's not center aligned. The two shapes are different sizes. But you can see a line there, a dashed line, that tells me that they're now left aligned. And now they're center aligned. And now they're right aligned. And if I pull it down the page, top aligned, center aligned, bottom aligned. So that shows you how straightforward it is to align shapes using the dynamic grid. Let's look at spacing next. I'm going to move this square around a little more. You remember when I was moving it before, I pointed out that double-headed arrow there. And that indicates spacing, and it can mean a couple of different things. One of the things it can mean is that the space between the square and the circle is currently set at the defined preferred spacing distance. So I'm going to release that square here. Let's click away. I'm going up to the Position button in the Arrange group on the Home tab, and I'm going to look at spacing options, because in there we have a definition of the distance between shapes, what we have currently set as our standard distance, and I'm going to change it from 0.375 inches up to an inch. Now when this box is checked, use same spacing for both. It means both the horizontal and vertical spacing are the same, so they're both now set to 1 inch. I'm going to click on Apply, click on OK. Now let me move that square around. Now I don't get that double-headed arrow where it was, but if I go up here, I can now know that the distance between the square and the circle is an inch. Now there is another way that the spacing can be indicated by the dynamic grid as well, and that is, let's suppose that I get a different shape altogether, the octagon here, and I'm going to drag it below the circle. Now watch what happens as I move down here. There's the spacing. Now let me move the square to something other than the default spacing. So the space between the square and the circle and the octagon and the circle is currently different. Let me move the octagon down, and when I get to the point that the octagon is the same spacing distance from the circle as the square is, I get a pair of double-headed arrows. Neither of them are at that default 1-inch spacing, but they are at the same spacing. So those double-headed arrows can indicate either, if you like, standard spacing, the defined spacing, or equal spacing. And finally, there's one other thing that we can do with the dynamic grid, which is also very helpful, and that is that we can use it for resizing purposes. These three shapes are of course very different, but each of them has an overall height and an overall width, or if you like, a maximum height or a maximum width. And if I were to try to resize the octagon, supposing I wanted it to be the same size as the circle, i.e. to have the same maximum height, the same maximum width, let me just drag a corner of the octagon and watch carefully what happens. I get to a point where I have a pair of double-headed arrows on the sides of the circle and a pair on the sides of the octagon, and that means that the height of the circle and the height of the octagon are currently the same, and the widths are the same as well. And if I drag the octagon down again, I'll very quickly and easily get to a point where its overall height and width are the same as they are for the square as well. And one other thing, let me just drag the octagon to the right and sort of misshape it a bit. You see now that it has the same width as the circle. Put it back, it has the same width as the square. So you can use the dynamic grid for resizing purposes as well. Now I should point out that the dynamic grid is just one of a whole toolbox of tools that you're going to learn how to use in Visio, but it's a very helpful one, very useful for doing quick visual alignments and so on. Now one of the disadvantages on this course is that you'll quite often see those double-headed arrows and those dashed lines and so on appearing when they're not really what I'm trying to demonstrate. I hope that now it'd be straightforward for you to understand when we're actually using the dynamic grid and when we're not. I often forget to switch it off, but don't be too distracted by those when they appear and they're not really relevant to what we're doing at that moment. But that's it for this section. I'll see you in the next one. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Visio 2016. In the previous section we looked at the use of the dynamic grid, in particular to help with aligning shapes. And in this section we're going to look at some of the other tools that are used for alignment, but also more generally for positioning shapes in Visio. We'll look first at the use of rulers, then we'll look at the Visio grid, we'll look at snapping, I'll show you how to use guides, and finally we'll look at gluing. Let's start by looking at rulers. And in fact, one thing you may have noticed, and it's probably the same on your installation of Visio, is that you already have rulers along the top of the drawing window and the left-hand side of the drawing window. I haven't so far used the term drawing window. I'm going to start to use it a little bit more from now on. And in order to explain the drawing window, I want to just quickly go into a different theme. Now the drawing window is the rectangle that effectively is bounded by the rulers. And you will notice that the current drawing, the one that we created in the preceding section, is on a page, a white page, and behind that white page we have a grey area that is not part of the drawing. That grey area is referred to as the canvas. Now there's one setting that may be very important to you later on, but I need to point it out to you now, and that is that if you go to the Design tab, there is an option there, auto size. This is basically a binary option, so you can switch it on or you can switch it off. Now if it's switched off, which it is at the moment, I can take a shape, say an octagon here, and I can drop it onto the canvas. Now I may want to do that if I've got a shape that I'm about to use. I haven't quite decided where to put it yet. There may be something special about that particular shape. All the time it's sitting on the canvas, it's not part of the drawing. If I save the drawing, that shape sitting on the canvas will be saved with it. So when I open the drawing again, I can carry on from where I left off. Let me just select that shape and delete it. Now let me go back to the Design tab and click on Auto Size so that it's on. Do the same thing again. Drag a shape. This time when I release it, what it actually does is to increase the size of the drawing. So basically you can add shapes in such a way that as you add them, the paper, if you like, gets bigger to accommodate those shapes. So rather than being placed outside the drawing area on the canvas, sort of ready to use, but not actually yet part of the drawing itself, this option gives you the ability to basically extend the drawing automatically as you add shapes to it. Now what I'm going to do for the moment is to undo that, and I'm going to switch auto size off again, and let me just switch back to the theme I was using before. So let's look now at the rulers in a bit more detail. If you look at the horizontal ruler at the top, you can see that the top left corner of the drawing is aligned with the 0 point on the ruler. And that's the default for drawings in Visio 2016. If you look at the vertical ruler, you'll see that the 0 mark there is at the bottom left hand corner of the drawing page. Now it is possible to change the position of the origin. But apart from the origin position, you then have scale marks along the horizontal and vertical rulers. And one of the things that really takes a little bit of getting used to for many people is the fact that these marks, although they have a true physical representation, will not correspond to a physical measurement on the screen. Considering this particular drawing, which I created as a default blank drawing, I just did a Control N in the preceding section, then I'm going to talk about the dimensions of the drawing a little bit later on. But basically, if I measure that using a ruler on my screen physically, which I've just done, on my screen it's about 5 inches wide, or about 14 centimeters wide, and the height is around 7 inches, about 18 centimeters, something like that. Now that has nothing to do with the graduations, the marks on the ruler. And in fact, if I take this same drawing and look at it on one of my laptops, then I would find that the physical size would be completely different. It would be much smaller. I'm recording this on a device with really quite a big screen. So the first thing to bear in mind is that those markers represent something, but they don't represent physically how big it is on your computer screen. Bear in mind that with Visio you could be drawing anything from a tiny circuit board, each of those markers might be a millimetre or something like that, right up to planning out a whole city, so each of those could be miles or kilometres. Now one of the things that's very useful with the ruler is that you can actually use it for positioning and alignment. Now in order to demonstrate this, you're going to have to look at the screen very carefully because it's quite difficult to see. But what I'm going to do is to move that square, the top shape there, left and right. Now if I select it, you'll see nothing on the ruler at all, but if I move it left and right, you'll see little marks appear while I'm moving it, and these will show me where the boundaries of that square are as far as the ruler is concerned. Now watch carefully, you see those little dotted lines as I move it? So if I wanted to align the left with 3 on the ruler, that's what I've now done. I could then of course do the same with the circle. And again, you can only see those little markers when it's moving. Once I've stopped moving it, in this case it's still selected, but there are no markers. The same of course goes for vertical movement as well. If you look at the left ruler now, you'll see the little markers on the left ruler. So I've top aligned that with the 10 mark on the ruler. And the other thing you need to be aware of is that you can switch the rulers off. If I go to the View tab, one of the options there is to switch the rulers off. The rulers have gone. But what I want to do on this occasion is to switch the rulers back on, and I'm also going to switch on the grid. With the grid switched on, you see this grid on the paper. And there is a setting whereby you can change the granularity of the grid. If you go to the View tab, in the Show group, click on the dialog box launcher to bring up the Rulers and Grid dialog box. Now, with grid spacing, it's currently set to fine. If I want to set it to, say, normal, note that I can set it independently for horizontal and vertical. Let's try that. And one of the things that I can use the grid for is to align objects. Now, in order to demonstrate this, I'm just going to switch off the dynamic grid, otherwise things will get very confusing. Let's assume for some reason that I'm not going to use the dynamic grid on this occasion. What I want to do is to just align with the grid almost visually. It's actually not quite visually at the moment, but I'll explain that a little bit later on. And there we are. Now, the standard settings for the grid have certain sizes for those squares of the grid, but you can actually set a custom size. At the moment, the width and height of each grid block is half a unit. You can check that on the ruler. Let me go into the ruler and grid dialog again and change from normal to fixed. And with fixed, I can decide what I want my minimum spacing to be. So I could say I want the spacing to be 2 inches. So that's horizontal and vertical 2 inches. Note also that I can change the grid origin within this dialog box as well. And of course, in the top part of the dialog, I could change the subdivisions on the rulers. So I could change the ruler 0 as well in this dialog box. But I've set that to 2 inches horizontal and vertical. And of course, I've got much bigger blocks now. Now let me open one of our other drawings. I'm going to open exercise 1 again. Now, one thing you'll notice about exercise 1 is that the ruler markings are completely different, and they're actually got little feet markers. And as you can see, the ruler is 0 feet top left, and then it goes 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot, and so on. Let me switch the grid on and the dynamic grid off, and let me go into that dialog box. Here, I'm going to set the grid to be 5 feet. Now, obviously, this has got absolutely nothing to do with the size of the picture on the screen. The grid is based on the dimensions of the object that you're working on. Now, in this case, I'm working on a room which is about 22 feet by about 17 or 18 feet, and therefore a 5 foot grid will look like that. Now, I need to explain the difference between the physical size of the object being drawn and the drawing on the paper in the next section, so you just need to bear with me until we get to that point. Let me go back into our shapes drawing. What I'm going to do here is to zoom in, and I'm going to talk about snapping. At the moment, if I say select this circle and move it to the left, watch what happens as I approach that grid line. You may just about see that at the last moment it snaps to that line. If I pull it away, do that again, and it just snaps to accurately align with that line. That's called snapping, and by default snap to grid is enabled in Visio 2016. If you want to disable that behavior, if you go to the Visual Aids group on the View tab, there is an option there that says currently active, and you can disable snap. If I click on OK now, If I move that circle around, there is no snapping behavior at all. It's probably very difficult to see that on the screen, so I suggest you give that a try yourself and just sort of get a feel for the difference. There's no snapping going on there at all now. And something else to mention about snapping, if I go back into the snap and glue dialog, there is an advanced page. And on the advanced page, you can actually set the snap strength. You can snap to rulers, grid, guides, points, geometry, extensions. We'll cover one or two or more of these later on in the course, but that's how you can set the strength of that snap effect. I've switched the dynamic grid back on, and note also in the show group that I have the guides checkbox checked. One of the things you may have noticed about the dynamic grid is that it doesn't always work. And in the situation here, I've got the same three shapes in my drawing, but I've made the circle bigger. The circle will act as a barrier in terms of aligning the octagon with the square. If I move the octagon from side to side, ignore the spacing there, you'll notice that it right aligns there with the circle, but as I move it to the left, it never shows right alignment with the square. That's because the circle is a barrier. One way around this is to use guides for alignment. So what I'm going to do is to add a vertical guide. It's a straightforward thing to do. If I hover over the ruler on the left, I get that double-headed arrow, drag to add a vertical guide. So what I want to do is click and drag, and I can position a guide for alignment. So let's suppose I want to align those two at 2.5 units. Note the dash line, release, there's my guide. Now if I look at the visual aids group on the view tab and go for the dialog box, you notice that glue is enabled. And what I'm going to do now is to align the square with that guide with glue enabled. And what you'll see as it aligns is that the colour and shape of the handle on the left there changes, and you probably saw that little message there as I moved it over. Glue to guide appears. Let me do the same with the octagon. Again, you see the little message, glue to guide. Now, before I align the circle, what I'm going to do is to go back into that Visual Aids Snap and Glue dialog and uncheck glue, and now I'm going to move the circle to align with the guide as well. I can still align it, and you can see, but it says snap to guide. So two are glued to the guide and one is snapped to it. If I click over where the guide is again to make the guide visible, watch what happens as I drag that guide. The two that are glued to it move. The one that's snapped to it doesn't. So that's a great way of doing alignment. You can have horizontal guides or vertical guides, and you can have as many of each as you like. And to remove a guide, all I need to do is to select it, just click over the guide to select it, and then press the delete key, and it's gone. And one final point here, you won't see guides when you print a drawing in Visio 2016. You can optionally show grid lines, but you don't need to worry about these extraneous lines appearing unless you actually want them to. That's the end of this section. I'll see you in the next one. Hello again, and welcome back to our course on Visio 2016. It's time now to start to look at the rather tricky subject of sizes. And in this section we're going to look first at the page setup dialog, then we're going to look at page properties, and then we'll look at three different sizes associated with drawings. The physical size of the object being drawn, which doesn't always exist by the way. There is page size, and then there's what we call print or paper size. There is a sort of a fourth size associated with drawings, and that's the size as the drawing appears on your computer screen. But of course you adjust that using things like your zoom controls, and we won't be covering any aspects of the size of the drawing as it appears on the screen in this section. The first thing we're going to look at then is the page setup dialog. I have Course Drawing 4 open at the moment. In the Page Setup group on the Design tab, if I click on the little launcher, I see the Page Setup dialog. And this dialog has 6 tabs. I'm not going to worry at all about the last 2 tabs at the moment, Layout and Routing and Alt Text. I'm only really interested in the first 4. Now, of those 4, the first 3 relate directly to size. But what I want to look at first is the 4th one, which is the Page Properties tab. Now, the contents of this tab are very important. First of all, you specify whether this page is a foreground page or a background page. I haven't yet distinguished between foreground pages and background pages, and all of the pages we've used so far have been foreground pages. So bear with me on that for the moment, and we'll come back to foreground and background a little bit later on. The name of the current page is in the next box, and it gets a default name when the page is created. If I wanted to change that here, I could. So for instance, I could change the name to Shapes Demo 01 or something like that. If there is going to be a background page, I can select it here. A drop down there shows my background pages. I don't currently have any. And for measurement units, I can choose between all of these options. Now, so far you may have been wondering how measurement units have been determined for the drawings that we've done. Clearly, drawings drawn from templates generally have their measurement units defined in them. But if at any time you need to change the measurement units on a particular drawing or even on a particular page, you have a very good choice there, including not only inches but things like centimeters and kilometers and all sorts of things. Don't forget the comment I made earlier about laying out the plan for a town. So kilometers or miles might be units that you'll need one day. So I'm happy with the content of the Page Properties tab now. I don't have to click OK to apply these changes. If I just click on Apply, you'll see, for example, that the page name has changed down to the bottom left of the drawing window. The next thing that I want to look at is physical size, the size of the object or entity being drawn. And when you're using Visio, and of course this will largely depend on what you're using it for, it's quite likely that sometimes you'll be drawing things which are physical entities and sometimes they aren't. In the case of the shapes on the page that I've used in the last few sections to demonstrate things like grids and guides and so on, this was never meant to represent any physical objects. It's really just some shapes drawn on an electronic piece of paper. So this has no physical size. On the other hand, the drawing, if I printed it, would look like a drawing of some objects. Now, in the case of this kind of drawing, or something like, for example, a flowchart or a process flowchart, it's usually the case that there will be no physical size associated with it. So the physical size and the drawing size are the same. And if I click on Drawing Scale, you'll see that the drawing scale, there is no scale, it's a one-to-one representation. So really what I'm looking at on the pages is the object that I'm representing, because it isn't a physical object. In this case it's a set of shapes, not actual physical shapes, but representations of a square, a circle and an octagon. And if I were, for example, looking at a flowchart now, I wouldn't be thinking in terms of one box in the flowchart being 2 meters by 1 meter. I'd just be thinking of it as a rectangle on an electronic piece of paper. So the physical size here is the same as what we call the page size that we're going to look at next. On the other hand, let me just cancel this. Let me switch to exercise 1. And for exercise 1, I'm now going to look at the page setup dialog, and I'm going to look at drawing scale. Now, in the case of exercise 1, we are representing a physical entity, an office, and there is a physical size for the thing that we're drawing. And in order to represent that physical entity, we are going to use a scale. The scale will enable us to represent it on, if you like, an electronic piece of paper, which isn't quite as big as the physical office is intended to be. Now, there are a number of standard scales available in Visio 2016, and in this particular case the template has used the standard architectural scale, which is a 1/2 inch in the drawing represents a foot in the office. Now, there are other standard scales: civil engineering, metric, mechanical engineering. Architectural is the one that's used here. And in fact, you also have the option of a custom scale. So if I wanted to make up my own scale, I can pretty much put any scale I like in there. What dimension on the page in the left represents what physical dimension on the right. Now, I'm going to stick with architectural. Bearing that in mind, what does the page represent? And what the page represents is a drawing which is 22 feet by 17 feet. So in this case, the physical size of the entity is 22 feet by 17 feet, and that's represented by this single page in the drawing. So given my drawing, which is planned on a 22 foot by 17 foot physical size, and with an architectural scale will fit onto this single page, my page size is 1 page, in this case of standard letter size paper. If I wanted to print this out, then in its simplest form I would go to the Print Setup tab, choose paper of letter size, and of course this drawing will fit onto 1 page of letter size paper. If I wanted to use a different size of paper, I could either rescale the picture using Print Zoom, and I'm going to be talking about printing later on in the course, or I could say that I don't want to rescale the picture because it would, for example, mean making some things too small. I can specify that the picture can be spread over, say, 2 sheets across and 2 sheets down. So when I come to do the printing, and as I say, I'll come back to that later, I can further change the size of what I'm printing. So I could take this drawing, for example, and print it on several sheets of A4 paper, in which case the individual components would look much bigger, but maybe if I needed to see detail, that would be a better bet. I might then glue all those pieces together and stick them on the wall. Similarly, I could take a drawing with a very large page size and print it on very small paper by scaling it down at the stage of printing it. So the page size and the print size in this case by default are the same, but using the Print Setup facility I can rescale what I'm doing to print to whatever scale that I want. Now, as I mentioned a couple of times there, we're going to be looking at printing in more detail later on. But for the moment, let me just give you a quick demonstration of what I've just been talking about. Let's stick with our office picture, and let's suppose that we need to make the office a little bit longer. Now, I want to stick with architectural scale, and if I make the office longer, it's not going to fit on this single sheet of paper. Let's look at a couple of ways that I might deal with this. Supposing I check the Auto Size button in the Page Setup group on the Design tab, and let me make the office longer just by stretching it. Watch what happens. Automatically, what Visio does is to give me a second, if you like, piece of paper. And if I go into the Setup dialog again, go to the page size, I've still got this option selected, let Visio expand the page as needed. But the little graphic on the right tells me what's happened. Because now, if you look at the little graphic for printer paper, which is still set at letter size, that's that left-hand section there. But because I've asked Visio to do things automatically for me, what it's done is to create me a bigger drawing page, which is in effect twice the size of the original page. So now you can see that the drawing page is going to be too big to fit on 1 sheet of paper. And if I go to Print Setup, the little graphic there will tell me the same. Now, of course, I could use the print zoom facility to scale it down to fit onto a page still, but of course it's going to make all the detail much smaller. So now you can see the difference between the page size, which is sort of 2 pages if you like, or at least it's more than one, and that would need 2 sheets of letter size paper unless I did some print zooming. Now let me cancel that and undo that and switch off auto size. And let me do the same thing again. I'm going to make the picture bigger. But because auto size is switched off, all that happens now is the picture is too big to fit onto the facility, the available piece of paper. Now because auto size is switched off, Visio isn't taking care of giving me more electronic paper. So now when I go back into the dialog, what I need to do is to take charge of that situation myself, because I need to have a bigger piece of paper, electronic paper, for this drawing. So for instance, let's suppose I decided that a 14-inch long size would do the job. And in fact, if I apply that, yep, the drawing does fit in there. But notice that vertical dashed line. That indicates a page break. So looking at this ultimately in terms of letter size pages, this is occupying more than one page. And once again, the little graphic on the right there is showing you how this actually is, because with printer paper 11 by 8.5, that's that rectangle, my drawing page is going to be 1 and a bit printer pages. But in that situation, of course, I'm handling the situation manually. Notice in this case, if I go back to drawing scale, of course, I've still got the architectural scale, but it recognizes that my drawing page is bigger than my printer paper. And of course, the page size represented now in my actual physical units is 28 feet by 17 feet. That's the end of this section. I'll see you in the next one.
For the next section, you'll want to download the course exercise files. Click the link below in the video description to get these. You can also scroll through the details to find timestamps for each section in this course. If you're enjoying this training, please leave us a comment.
Welcome back to our course on Visio 2016. It's time now for exercise 2. And in exercise 2, I'd like you to draw a nice set of traffic lights. Now, this is a set of traffic lights and a drawing with a little bit of a difference in that I'm going to give you some very exact measurements. The first of which is that the page size needs to be 120 millimeters by 240 millimeters, which is not a standard page size, it's a custom size, and I'd like you to use metric units. The body of the traffic lights, the main rectangular section, not the pointy bit on top, but the rectangular section, needs to be 80 millimeters wide and 160 millimeters high. And each of the 3 lights, the red, amber, green, is a 40 millimeter diameter circle, and those 3 lights are equally spaced from each other. I would like you to colour it all in. As you can see there, using fill commands. We haven't really looked at fill in detail before, but I mentioned a couple of aspects of formatting earlier on in the course, and if you look out for fill commands either on a mini toolbar or on the home tab, I'm sure you can figure that out okay. That's exercise 2. I'll see you in the next section. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Visio 2016. In this short section we're going to take a look at the drawing tools, which I've used once or twice already, but I just need to explain in a little bit more detail. Although you'll often use shapes from stencils when you're creating drawings using Visio 2016, you pretty much always have available to you a set of drawing tools that can be very useful to add things like squares and lines and so on to any drawing that you're working on. Now, in order to demonstrate these, I've taken course file 4 and I'm saving it as course file 5, and I'm going to delete all of the shapes in this drawing. I'm going to talk in more detail about selecting shapes in the next section, but generally speaking, one way of selecting all the shapes in a drawing is to use the Control A keyboard shortcut. which I've just done. They're now all selected. Then all I need to do is to press the delete key and all of the shapes are deleted from this drawing. Now on the Home tab in the Tools group, top right hand corner of that group normally, if you click on the little drop down you can see the 6 drawing tools: rectangle, ellipse, line, freeform line, arc and pencil. And I'm going to demonstrate these using the first one, rectangle. If I click on rectangle to select it and then move the cursor over the page, you'll see that the cursor now has that cross shape and it has a little picture of a rectangle bottom right hand corner, which just reminds me that the tool I have selected is the rectangle tool. All I need to do is to click and draw my rectangle and I have a rectangle. Now not only do I have a rectangle, but if I move the cursor away I've still got the same cursor, which means that I can draw another rectangle. When, for example, you're using the rectangle drawing tool, if what you really want is a square, all you need to do is to hold the Shift key down, and when I draw now I will get a square rather than a rectangle. And similarly, if you hold the Shift key down while you're drawing an ellipse, you'll get a circle. And just a couple of other things to note. I still have my rectangle cursor. To basically cancel the drawing tool, normally the best thing to do is to just click on the pointer tool, also in the tools group. That puts you back to having your regular pointer tool. And with any shape that you've drawn, including those drawn in this way, if I select a shape, right click on it and click on Format Shape, I bring up the Format Shape panel on the right, and using that panel I can do things like change the color of the fill and so on. Now I'm going to be looking at formatting shapes and text and so on throughout the rest of the course, so I'm not going to go into that now. But you might want to take this opportunity to do a little bit of practice. Maybe just try, for instance, the freeform tool and just get used to using those drawing tools, because I think you will find them useful as you build up your skills in using Visio 2016. That's the end of this section. I'll see you in the next one. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Visio 2016. You should be pretty comfortable with putting shapes onto a page now, and what we're going to concentrate on in this section is how to select one or more of those shapes in order to perform some kind of operation on the shape or shapes. So in this section we're going to look first at why we select. Then I'll look at how to select multiple shapes. There are a couple of options. We'll look at using the lasso select tool. And then I'll look at selecting shapes within an area. And finally we'll also take a look at cutting, copying, pasting and duplicating shapes. The first question is then, why do we have to be able to select shapes? Well, you've seen part of the answer to that already, and that is that for many things that you do in Visio, in order to do them you need to select the shape or shapes that you want to do those things to. And something that makes life a little bit more complicated in Visio is that you may have dozens, even perhaps hundreds of shapes on a particular drawing, and you may need to select any number of them. Now you could say, well, why don't you just select them one at a time? Well, sometimes if you need to perform an operation on many shapes, it will be very inefficient, take a very long time to do those operations one at a time, and it's often very difficult to do exactly the same thing to several different objects, different shapes separately anyway. So it's often the case that if you need to, for example, fill a dozen shapes with the same color, rather than do them one after the other, it's much more efficient to select all of the shapes and then perform the operation once. And something else which complicates that is that if you have got a drawing with many shapes in it, sometimes you may want to select shapes that are all very close to each other. Sometimes you may want to select shapes which are dotted around all over the drawing, and it may be that that makes it particularly difficult to select the shapes that you need. Now we've already seen one or two selection techniques, so let me just open that drawing 5 again. In its simplest form, to select a shape, all I need to do is to click with the mouse or tap with my finger. And selecting one shape is very easy. If I want to select a couple of shapes, all I need to do is, for example, hold the Shift key down, tap on the second one. And really the thing that I want to concentrate on next is how you select multiple shapes. Let's look then at some of the options for selecting multiple shapes. I've now got 5 shapes on this drawing, and if I click, say, on the top left one there, the rectangle at the top, it's now selected. Let me hold the Control key down and click on the square on the right. Now you note the bounding box that seems to indicate what is selected, but in fact you need to be a little bit careful about this, because if you look at the 4 shapes in that box, 2 of them have a broader border, and what's happened with those, because they're selected, is that there is an additional border around them to indicate that they are part of the selection, whereas the circle and the ellipse haven't been selected, and therefore although they're in that box, they're not part of the selection. So if, for example, I wanted to perform an operation on my selection, such as changing the fill color, it would only apply to those 2 shapes. So let me just undo that, and I'm going to hit the Escape key to cancel the selection. And I've switched back to the pointer tool here. There is another way that you can select multiple shapes, and what I'm going to do on this occasion is to actually click with the mouse to the top left of the top left shape and draw a rectangle. But this will be a selection rectangle, and when I release the mouse, you'll now see that all 4 shapes are selected. And if I did the fill again now, of course, I'd be filling all 4 of those shapes. So that can be a very useful way of selecting many adjacent shapes. Although in this case, drawing the rectangle won't work in all situations. But there is an alternative. Let me just press the Escape key to cancel that selection. And what I'm going to do now is to go to the Editing group on the Home tab, and one of the tools there is a Select tool. I'm going to click on the drop down on the Select tool, and I'm going to use Lasso Select. Now you may notice with this Lasso Select that just above that Area Select is also available, and in fact Area Select is what I just did when I drew that rectangle. With Lasso Select it's going to make a multiple selection, but I can do it with an irregular shape. So let's suppose I want to just select 2 of these shapes, the circle and the oval. I'm going to start drawing here, click and draw, and lasso the shapes that I want to select. And when I complete my lasso, you'll see that my selection now only has the circle and the ellipse in it. They're the only ones with that selection bounding box. And if I wanted to change the color of just those 2, that's straightforward enough as well. Now, apart from hitting the Escape key to cancel a selection, if I just click outside the drawing, that will cancel it as well. One other thing to be aware of in relation to multiple selections is that if you do them using, for example, Area Select, let's go for Area Select, that's the rectangular one again. Let me draw another rectangle to make a selection, but notice that that square is not totally within the selection box, the Area Select box. And you'll see that it's not actually part of the selection. Now what I'm going to do is to go into my Visio options, go into Advanced, and in the editing options, the first main section there is a checkbox, Select Shapes Partially Within Area. I'm going to check that now, and what that will do is to make sure that any shapes that are partly within an area selection are indeed selected. So I've changed that to be checked, click on OK. I'm going to cancel this selection. I'm going to do that Area Select again, and this time the right hand shape is within the selection. You can see it's got that selection box around it. I normally operate without that box check, so anything which isn't totally within an area selection for me is not selected, but you may prefer the alternative. The final thing I want to look at in this section is cutting, copying, pasting and duplicating shapes. This works in pretty much the way that you would probably expect it to work, although for those of you who've used earlier versions of Visio, some aspects of how it works have changed. In its simplest form, if I select one of these shapes, let's say I select that circle, I'm going to right click and click on copy. If I then just do a paste, what happens is that the pasted copy appears slightly offset from the original. In earlier versions of Visio, it used to be the case that when you did a paste, it always appeared by default in the middle of a drawing. Now, of course, if I wanted actually to put that circle somewhere else, it'd be straightforward enough. I could just drag it into position. But if I want to put it somewhere specific, let me undo that. If I click somewhere else in the drawing, so I'm going to click above a space between the rectangle and the ellipse and do the paste again, now when I do the paste, it appears where I clicked. Clearly the principle with cut and paste is the same, and of course you can copy and paste or cut and paste multiple shapes. So let's select 3 shapes. I'll stick with the newly pasted circle. I'll select a couple of other shapes as well. What I'm going to do is to copy them using the standard keyboard shortcut of Control-C, and I think I'll have a new page actually. And what I'm going to do is to paste them onto the new page. I'm not going to click on the page first, I'm just going to do Control-V, and the 3 shapes appear in as close as possible to the same position that they were when I copied them, but of course on the new page. And then just a couple of useful things to know in relation to duplication. If I wanted to duplicate these 3 shapes, given that they're already selected, there is a keyboard shortcut of Control-D that duplicates. So that gives me another set of the same 3 shapes in the same orientation. And let me just deselect. With any shape, if I select it, and having selected it, if I then hold down the Control key and drag the shape, you notice the cursor's got a little plus to the top right of it. When I then release the mouse, I've duplicated the shape and put the duplicate in whatever position I left it in. That's the end of this section. I'll see you in the next one. Welcome back to our course on Visio 2016. In this section we're going to look in more detail at resizing and rotating shapes. We've already done some resizing and rotating, but there really is quite a bit more to it than you've seen so far on the course. And these 2 types of operation can be particularly important. In this section, I'm going to start with a warning. Then I'm going to show you how to resize using sizing handles. And I'm going to introduce you to something called the pin. We'll then look at the size and position window. And finally, I'll talk to you about locked shapes. So let me start with that warning, which might sound quite dramatic, and I'm going to demonstrate the essence of this warning towards the end of this section, but I want to warn you now. When you use templates to create drawings, or when you get drawings from other people, it's quite possible that some of the shapes may be locked in some way. And I'll show you later on how to recognize that a shape is locked. But one of the consequences of this can be that, for example, you can't resize a shape. Now, I've seen many times people, particularly people who are new to Visio, trying to resize a shape that is locked so that they can't resize it, getting very frustrated. So be wary, you can't necessarily resize everything that you come across in Visio, and you may just have to accept sometimes that you can't resize a shape, or you need to know how to unlock it in such a way that you can resize it. But don't assume, for example, that if you can't resize a shape, it's your fault, you're doing something wrong. It's possible that the shape is locked in such a way that it can't be resized. As I say, I'll tell you more about this a little bit later on. The next thing to look at is virtually revision. If I select a particular shape, say that rectangle, I get those little white handles in the corners. These are sometimes referred to as the selection handles or the resizing handles or just the handles. And as you'll know by now, you can make the shape wider or taller, or if you want to maintain the aspect ratio, you can do both by dragging one of the corner handles. And in fact, if I select two shapes, say that one and that one, notice that with those two selected shapes, there are other shapes within that bounding rectangle, of course, that aren't selected. I can resize the selection. So let me resize that selection. Notice the little message there, resize as group. I'll talk about groups more later on, but watch what happens now. I'm resizing those two selected shapes. Now resizing really is as simple as that, and as you'll know, let me just go back to the View tab, make sure my dynamic grid is turned on. As you know, if I take another shape, say this one, and start resizing it, at any point that some aspect of its dimension matches something else, I'll get those helpful visual signals from the dynamic grid. So in this particular case, the width of this circle is the same as the width of the smaller of the two rectangles on its left. If I keep dragging the circle, eventually its width matches the bigger of those two rectangles on its left. Now when it comes to resizing objects, this is one of the ways that you'll probably find yourself using quite a bit, and as you've already seen, the dynamic grid can help greatly with that. In Course File Drawing 7, I've got a single shape, just this rectangle, and if I select it, you've already seen the use of that rotation handle there. I can use that to rotate the shape. Now something that I haven't pointed out before is that if you look very carefully inside the shape, and actually what I'm going to do is to clear the fill, you'll see that there's a tiny little line here going to another little handle that's currently right in the middle of the shape, and that is the center of rotation, and we normally refer to this as the pin. And when I rotate something in Visio, I rotate about the pin. Bear that in mind. I'm going to come back to the pin again in just a moment. Now we're going to turn our attention to a very important feature of Visio 2016, and that is the size and position window. And what I'm going to do in order to show that is to go up to the View tab, Show Group Task Panes, and click on Size and Position. And that brings up a very useful little window with information about the X position of the currently selected shape, the Y position, the width and the height. I also have information about its current angle, and I also have an indication of its pin position. Now I've just shown you one way of accessing the size and position window. Let me just close it again. Provided that you have a shape selected, you will normally see dimensions such as width, height and angle on the status bar, provided you've enabled those. Another way that you can get the size and position window to appear is literally to just click on one of those and the size and position window will appear. And that's, for many people, the preferred way to bring the size and position window up. Now, not only does this window give you information about this selected shape in this case, but it also lets you change that information. So for instance, if I just wanted to change the height of this rectangle, note it's currently 3 inches. If I click on there, change it to 2 inches, click somewhere else, and the height is changed. Let me change the width, say to 2 inches to make it a square as well. And that's changed. And if I were to drag this square around on my drawing, look what happens to the X and Y positions as I do that. They're of course updated as I move it. Now let me rotate it. Note the angle of rotation is indicated -45 degrees. And as with width and height, I can set the angle of rotation there as well. And the other useful thing I can do here, note at the moment that the pin is in the position that's called center. Let me click there and click on the drop down. I can also change the pin position. Now the pin position of center left means that vertically the pin will be in the center of the shape, but it will be on the left hand edge. So now if I rotate the shape, it will be about the sizing handle that started out in the center of the left hand edge of the shape. So you can also change the pin position as well using the size and position window. One of the things that's really good about the size and position window is that you can very accurately, literally size and position any shape in a drawing, and given that you can also set the angle very precisely, if you need to rotate shapes, it's a very accurate way of doing it, and it's pretty straightforward to use as well. Now, just one other thing to demonstrate about this, let me introduce a second shape onto the drawing. The second shape that I've introduced is an ellipse, and if you look at the size and position window, you can see that its width is 3.75 inches and its height is just over 1.5 inches. If I click on the original square, that's of course 2 by 2. Let me go back to the ellipse again, and with that selected, let me also select the square. Look at the size and position window when I select the square. You notice that it's still giving me the information about the ellipse. But let's suppose that in the size and position window I change the height from 1.5625 inches to say 3 inches. What do you think is going to happen? Well, because I've got both of those shapes selected, that height is applied to both shapes. They still have different widths, of course, but they now both have the same height. And if I change the angle of rotation from 0 degrees to say 60 degrees, again, look what happens. They're both rotated by 60 degrees. Now what happens when you have more than one shape selected using the size and position window will very much depend on the specific situation, and you will need to experiment with that a little bit. But it just shows that you can also use that window to set values for multiple shapes, even if you only want to set one or two of the values, such as the height or the angle of rotation. And the very last thing I want to show you here, we're sort of leaping ahead a little bit, but I've got this rectangle with the pin position center left, and currently its angle is 0 degrees. I can rotate it, I can resize it, and so on. But if I go to the Developer tab, now you may well not see the Developer tab, and if you don't see the Developer tab, all you need to do is to right click within the ribbon area on the right, go to Customize the ribbon, and make sure that Developer is checked in the tabs list there. Then you'll see your Developer tab. Go to the Developer tab, and in the Shape Design group there is a Protection option. And that brings up the protection dialog, and this is how you effectively lock a shape. So let's suppose I want to protect this shape from having its width changed, its height changed, its X position changed, and its rotation changed. So I can change the Y position, but I can't change width, height or rotation. Now you notice those little handles have now got lines through them to make them look like no entry signs. And if I click on that object and try and move it left or right, I can't, but I can move it up and down. That's a flavour of how protection and locking work. That's the end of this section. I'll see you in the next one. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Visio 2016. You should be getting pretty good at drawing shapes now, moving them around, positioning them, resizing, rotating and so on. Now we're going to move on to the next important phase, which is connecting shapes together. In this section we're going to start by looking generally at connections and glue. Then we'll look at using connectors, then at dynamic connectors. We'll then look at dynamic glue, and finally we'll look at glue options in Visio 2016. The first thing that I'm going to demonstrate here is how to connect those two shapes together in a way that isn't particularly good. It sort of works, it's not that bad, but there are better options. And what I'm going to do is to connect these two shapes together just with a straight line. So I've got a rectangle and a circle. I go to the Tools group on the Home tab and I select the Line drawing tool. So now what I now do is move the cursor down. Watch carefully what happens as I move towards the rectangle. When I get close enough, what happens is what are called connection points appear. 5 of them there. There's one on each side of the rectangle and one in the middle. And if I go to the one on the right, when I get close enough, I see a screen tip come up, glue to connection point. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to click at this point. Now having clicked, I now drag towards the circle. And again, as I get towards the circle, you'll see a whole load of connection points on and in the circle. Let's choose one of those. Let's choose that one. Note again, glue to connection point, release. Now what we've done there is to glue both ends. And the big advantage of gluing both ends is this. Let me take the pointer tool and let me move the circle. If I move the circle, the connection line stays connected. Similarly, of course, for the rectangle. Now the type of glue that we've used there is called static glue. I'll come back to that in a moment. But one very important aspect of glue is if I say click on the line again, you can see special little markers at the end of the line that indicate not only that there's glue, but what sort of glue it is. At the start of a line with static glue, you see a little green circle. And at the end, you see a white circle. It's got a green outline, but it's a white circle with a little green dot in the middle. Now what I'm going to do is to get rid of that line, just select it, delete it. And I'm going to do the same thing again, but I'm going to do it wrong. So I'm going to go down here. I think I'll click to this sign, glue to connection point. Yep. Keep the mouse down, drag over here. Now when I get to the circle, instead of connecting to one of the connection points, I'm just going to move around here a bit. And there you can see I've got a screen tip snap to geometry. So I'm going to release the line, and the line now ends there. Now one thing you notice is that although I've got start glue at one end, I haven't got end glue at the other. Once again, pointer tool, move the circle. Now when I move the circle, the line doesn't stay attached to it because the line wasn't glued to the circle. It was snapped to the geometry. Think of it as being snapped to the grid, if you like. So provided we use gluing to the shapes, it's a great way of connecting two shapes together. However, it does have its problems. And one of the problems is this. Let me put in another shape. Let me say put a triangle in here. If I wanted to connect the rectangle to the circle using static glue, I can do it, but I have to go through the triangle. And as I'm sure you'll realise, what I really need to do is to draw my line in such a way that it goes round the triangle. And if you've looked at circuit diagrams or many other types of technical drawing in particular, you'll know that in these situations the convention is to draw around obstacles or to indicate that you're routing around an obstacle in a particular way. So we need a more intelligent way of connecting things together than just drawing a line between them. And that's what we're going to look at next. We're going to look at using connectors. Now before we move on to using, if you like, the correct type of connector, let me show you another reasonably bad way of doing things. Let's suppose that I still want to connect the rectangle to the circle and I want to avoid the triangle. One other option I have is this. If I choose, for example, the freeform line from the drawing tools, I could actually draw a line something like this, say. And I now have a connection between those two shapes that goes round the triangle. And to all intents and purposes, it does work okay. So if, for example, I were to move the circle, then the freeform line would move with it as well. And in fact, if I say wanted to go down to there, and now of course my line is crashing into the triangle, one of the things I can do is go back to the freeform tool again, click on the freeform tool, and I could even distort it and make it go round the triangle again. So it is possible to manually circumvent those kind of obstacle type problems with a freeform line, or even with a set of straight lines as well. But it's a pretty arduous and awkward process, and as soon as you make a change to your drawing, you finish up with a lot of manual work to do. So what we use instead is not one of the drawing tools, but we use what's called a dynamic connector. So having selected my freeform tool, let me just delete that, put the circle back somewhere like where it was. And what I'm going to do now is to connect the rectangle to the circle using a dynamic connector. The connector is below the pointer tool in the Tools group on the Home tab. Once again, as I get a dynamic connector, note the little icon below and to the right of the cursor there. If I choose one of the connection points on the rectangle and just head towards the circle, and when I get the tip glue to connection point, drop it there, I now have the rectangle and the circle connected by a dynamic connector. Note static glue is in use. Now watch what happens if I move the circle around. Now the intelligence in the dynamic connector means that it will find its way round any obstacles. This isn't always done in what to me seems like the best possible way, but it's pretty good. And although you'll find that there are certain aspects of dynamic connectors that you may decide later on are rather frustrating, overall they're a good, efficient way of connecting shapes together. One of the things I said just now is that I'm not always happy with what the dynamic connector does, but in fact it's very easy to change it. If I select this dynamic connector, note that it has a number of handles, and you can manually change the routing. Now, I'm not saying the routing I'm setting up here is better than the one we had just now. I'm just showing that you can change it. So if I really did want to make this routing completely different, including, for example, putting that over there, then I can do it, and Visio is quite happy with it. And in fact, if you right-click on the connector itself, one of the options at the bottom is Reset Connector, and that puts it back to the way that Visio originally set up that dynamic connection. If I remove the obstacle, so if I got rid of that triangle, then if I want to work out a more efficient route now, I can either just delete the connector that's there, or, of course, I could work out something better myself anyway. Now, one of the most obvious issues in this particular case is that without the triangle there, you would probably connect to the bottom of the rectangle and not the top. And in fact, if I hover over the start point of the connector, note that I get the tooltip Move Endpoint. One of the things I can do manually is to move this round to connect to the lower connection point. And then that's a much more efficient and elegant routing. Similarly, I could do the same here over the circle, move endpoint, say go to the side connector. So you can adjust these manually, but ultimately Visio is going to make sure that the routing, if you like, doesn't hit obstacles, and that the routing generally always works. Let's look now at the other type of glue that is available in Visio 2016, and that is dynamic glue. What we do here when we connect objects using dynamic glue is that we connect not to a connection point on each shape, but to the shape itself. And then what Visio does is to choose the most appropriate connection point depending on the relative configuration of the shapes being connected. I use the same sort of connector, but now starting with the circle this time, I think. When I approach the circle, what I'll see is a green outline, a green border, a square border. And as I hover over it, if instead of clicking on one of the connection points, I click on the green border, I've glued to the shape itself, not to a connection point. Now if I go over to the rectangle until I see that screen tip glue to shape and now release the mouse, I have the two shapes connected using dynamic glue. Now what I'm going to do is to move the circle around. Note the connection points at the moment: left hand midpoint of the circle, right hand midpoint of the rectangle. Let me put the circle down here somewhere. Note now that the connection point to the circle is the one on the top. Eventually then we get a connection from the bottom of the rectangle to the top of the circle, and so on. And Visio is just adjusting and choosing the most suitable connection point at each stage. And the last point for this section, just to make sure that your gluing can progress smoothly to begin with, if you go to the View tab on the ribbon, one of the options we looked at before is accessed via the dialog box launcher in the Visual Aids group, and that's the Snap and Glue options. If you look at the Glue To options on the right, you need to make sure, if you're going to use dynamic glue, that is glue to shape, that the shape geometry option is checked. And you also need to make sure that you can glue to connection points in order to use static glue. You may or may not want to be able to glue to guides. I normally leave glue to guides on because I do occasionally use that, but you can also be able to glue to shape handles and to the vertices of shapes as well. I generally don't have those checked, but as you progress with Visio, you may discover that you need to be able to glue to those as well. So at the very least, I believe you need the top option and the bottom option checked. You may want to better glue to guides as well. I'm going to click on OK. That's the end of this section. I'll see you in the next one. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Visio 2016. In this short section I want to cover one other topic about shapes that we're going to be needing, and that is shape replacement. This was introduced in, I believe, Visio 2013 to cover situations where you have a particular shape in use and you want to change it to a different shape. It used to be the case that in order to do that, you had to delete the old shape and insert a new one. Now, in order to demonstrate the options here, let's suppose initially that I want to change that bin, the office paper bin up here, the round waste can. If I select it, one of the options on the Home tab in the Editing group is Change Shape. And clicking on that, I see the other shapes that are in the Office Accessories stencil. I can clearly choose one of those. One important point here is that Live Preview is enabled, so if I want to see what it's going to look like, perhaps with a square waste bin instead, or perhaps putting a plant in the corner, or maybe even having a man standing in the corner, probably not quite so practical. But I can choose one of those shapes, or if I go to the drop down up here, I can choose from other stencils that I have open, cubicles, office equipment, etc. I can also look at the current quick shapes, and you can see there the quick shapes for office accessories and other stencils as well. Back to the drop down again, you can also specifically ask for shapes in this document. So this is shapes that I'm already using in the current document. Now if you wanted to locate a different shape on a different stencil, all you would need to do would be to find that stencil and open it, which you know how to do, and that stencil will appear in the list on that drop down. Now incidentally, when it comes to change shape, there is another option as well. If I right click on the round bin, one of the options on the mini toolbar there is change shape as well, and that gives me exactly the same options. And the final point about changing shape, you're not restricted to doing it for just one shape. Let's suppose I've decided that these shapes here, these palm plant shapes, I want to replace all three of those with a flowering plant. So having collected the three, change shape. Let's go to Office Accessories. That's a flowering plant. Note the live preview there. I'm going to choose that option. And all three of those have now been replaced. That's shape replacement. I'll see you in the next section. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Visio 2016. In this section we're going to look at the basics of text in Visio 2016. You've already seen a little bit of text, but there's actually quite a lot to it in Visio, and in particular we have to draw a clear distinction between what are called text boxes and what are called text shapes, but I'm going to explain that in this section. First of all, I'm going to talk about shape text in general. Then we'll look at text blocks and the text block tool. Next we'll look at text alignment and orientation. Then at text shapes. And finally we'll look at formatting text. Let me start by dragging a circle shape onto this new diagram, which I'm saving as course file 10. Having dragged that shape into position, what I'm going to do without doing anything else at all is just to start typing. Now as soon as I start typing, I see the word circle appear in the middle of the circle. And that is inside what's called a text box within the circle shape. Now most of the shapes that you use in Visio will have text boxes assigned with them, but some of them don't, and it's very much a design decision for the shape designer whether there is a text box included. If there is a text box, it's mostly there to identify the shape, and of course in many of the drawings that you do you may well want to identify the shape by, for example, a reference number or a part number, or maybe an actual name for a desk or something like that. Now, much of the text that you see in Visio drawings is associated with shapes. And generally speaking, when you want to put text in a drawing and associate it with a shape, you put it in one of these text boxes that comes as part of the shape. But there is a different type of shape called a text shape, and I'll come back to text shapes a little bit later. But you use text shapes to put text on a drawing that isn't associated with a specific shape. So for example, you might use a text shape to put a title on your drawing, or maybe to put some kind of explanatory text that applies to the whole drawing and not just one particular shape. So let's first of all concentrate on text blocks. And I mentioned just now that when I typed the word circle, it automatically went into the text block associated with this shape. If I want to see the text block associated with this particular shape, first of all select the shape itself, and then click on this button here, text block. Now watch very carefully what happens when I do this. I'll click on text block. What you can see now is a rectangle with sizing handles that looks not much different from how it was a couple of seconds ago. The difference is that what I'm looking at here is the text block. And as you see, the text block in this case for this circle is nearly as big as the circle itself, and the text circle is right in the middle of it. As we're going to see in this section, I can do things like change the size of the text. I can even change the size and shape of the text block. So for instance, if generally speaking I wanted the word in this circle to appear not in the middle but towards the top of the circle, I could either change the alignment, I'll show you how to do that a bit later on, or I could even reshape the text block itself. Now not all shapes have text blocks right in the middle like that. Let me show you an alternative. Let's go to a completely different stencil and let me drag over here a computer terminal. Now notice it's currently selected, but if I want to know where its text block is, what I would do is to click on the text blocks tool, and you'll see that the text block is actually underneath it, and you can see those little sizing handles there. And if I started typing here, the words would appear down there. So exactly where the text block is will vary. However, you know now how to find the text block. And just so that you know, if I select that terminal shape again and its text block, you can actually move a text block relative to the shape. So I could, for instance, if I preferred to do so, maybe put the text block, say, somewhere like that. And then in fact, let me just select the whole shape itself again. When I move the shape around, the text block moves with it as well. So you can, to some extent, customize that as well. I want to look next at text alignment and orientation. I'm going to draw another circle. This one I'm going to make quite a bit bigger. And on this occasion, what I'm going to do is to change the size of the text to make it a little bit easier to see. So before I start typing text, I'm going to change from Calibri 10 point to Calibri 24 point using the controls in the font group on the Home tab. Now I'm going to type the word circle again. I'm going to select the circle, and I'm going to then identify the text block. So the text block has the word circle in it. If I want to change the alignment of the text, all I need to do is to use these buttons up here in the paragraph group. At the moment, I have align middle and align center. I could, for example, do align top, and what about right? And that'll put the text on the top right. Now let me just put it back in the settings it was in before. What I'm going to do now is to make this circle a little smaller. Just move it out of the way for a moment and draw a square. I'm going to change the point size to 24 point again and type the word square. Now my square at the moment is upright, if you like. What if I were to rotate the square? Note how the text rotates with it, which may well be the behavior that you'd like. But supposing you've rotated an object but you'd like the text to still read left to right conventionally upright and so on. What you can do with the shape square in this case selected is to select its text block and then use the rotation handle on the text block to just rotate the text back to being in the upright position. So you've still got a square. The square is at an angle, but the text in it isn't. Now there's one other thing I want to show you in association with this orientation, and that is this. Let me connect the circle to the square with a connector. There's my connector, and of course a connector has a text block. Let me go up and change the point size, say to 18 point, and start typing. What I'm now going to do is to select those three shapes by drawing a bounding box. What do you think will happen if I rotate those three? Watch carefully what happens. Now, strange things happen to that connector. Don't worry about that. But look at the text on the connector. The text on the connector stays upright. Connectors generally work on horizontal and vertical lines. And that's a very important point to remember, because the text block, the word connector in this case, will align itself with a horizontal or vertical section of the connector. I could have connected those two shapes by a line, and the text block with the line would have rotated, but then I wouldn't have had the advantages of using a dynamic connector. You may want to experiment with that yourself, but it's an important point to be aware of. So far we've been looking at text blocks which are associated with shapes. Let me just rotate that back again. The other situation, as I explained at the beginning, that we often have is that we need just some text, not to be associated with a specific shape. So for instance, we might want some text just as a title. So in this case, I use a text shape, and I use the text button here in the Tools group on the Home tab, and literally I draw myself a text shape. That has default formatting. I'm going to stick with the default formatting at the moment. I'm going to put in here the words demonstration of text. And that's basically it. That's a text shape. I can move it, I can position it, I can have several of those on a page, and it really is as simple as that. The last thing I want to look at in this section is formatting of text. If you've used something like Microsoft Word, or maybe you've used Excel, PowerPoint, you'll be used to text formatting, I'm sure, and pretty much the same principles apply here in Visio. At the moment I have the text shape at the top of the page selected. If I wanted to make that text larger, let me try larger sizes of text. A couple of things happen now. Live preview, of course. Let's say 30 point, that'll do for the moment. Note that the shape is still selected. Apart from doing things like change font and size and so on, I could also change the colour of the text. So let's change the colour to that olive green. I've now got olive green text. That's working on one selected shape. In fact, if I'd selected two or more shapes, then they would all have been affected by the same change. But I don't have to work on a whole shape. I can make a selection within a shape. Now, if I wanted to change, say, just the word text here, if I triple click over that, I'll find that all of the text is selected. Click where I want. Move the cursor if necessary. I'm just going to select the word text, and I'm going to change that to bold. And of course, one of the buttons in the font group here on the Home tab is bold. Don't forget, I have a dialog box launcher here which will take me into the text dialog, and here I can see the full range of text formatting that I can perform in Visio. So that enables me to format just a piece of text. And then finally, one thing of course that you can always do is to select all of the shapes on a page. So Control A selects everything. Let's suppose I want to change the font from Calibri to Algerian. And there we are. That's changed the font in every shape on the page. That's the end of this section. I'll see you in the next one.
For the next section, you'll want to download the course exercise files. Click the link below in the video description to get these. You can also scroll through the details to find timestamps for each section in this course. If you're enjoying this training, please leave us a comment.
Welcome back to our course on Visio 2016. It's time now for exercise 3. And in exercise 3, I would like you to draw a diagram of your home network if you have one. If you don't have a home computer network, perhaps you have a network at work, or draw some other kind of network. Maybe it's other interconnected equipment where you live or where you work. If you don't have any of those kinds of network, then basically use the drawing here, my sample solution to exercise 3, and draw that network. Now I should point out that each of the shapes has its own text block, and there is a drawing title as well. Although I've connected the shapes together, The wireless access point connections, so for instance from kids' tablets to wireless access point, there are no sort of real standards for that kind of thing that I've applied here. So I've just used one of these standard shapes to indicate a wireless connection. There's no need to worry about being too sort of formal if you're an electronic or electrical engineer and you deal with things like wireless access points. By all means draw this according to standards, but if you aren't, don't worry about it. Just indicate, as I have, the difference between wired connections and wireless connections. That's it really. That's exercise 3. I'll see you in the next section. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Visio 2016. In this section I'm going to look at proofing in Visio 2016. If you've used proofing in another one of the components of Microsoft Office 2016 before, then you can probably skip this section because the Visio proofing options are pretty much just an implementation of the general Microsoft Office proofing options. If you're not familiar with those or you'd like a bit of an update, then this isn't a very long section and I think you'll find it well worth working through. So first of all, I'm going to look at Office 2016 proofing in general, and then with specific reference to Visio 2016, I'll look at showing and hiding errors, at how Visio spell checking works, and at AutoCorrect and its options. The first thing to point out is that the general information available on office.com about proofing, that is spelling and grammar checking, applies to Visio 2016. At the time of recording this, there is a page, Check Spelling and Grammar in Office 2010 and later, and that covers all of the major components of Microsoft Office from the 2010 versions up to the 2016 versions. And if you're not familiar with this, it's a very good place to start. It will tell you many things such as how to run the spelling and grammar checker, how to show errors automatically while you work, and so on. Some of these I'm going to cover during this section, some of them I'm not going to cover. So make sure that if you're not already familiar with this material, you go carefully through that page and make sure that you fill in any gaps in your knowledge. So that's a good starting point if you're not familiar with this. Now let me refer specifically to the main features of proofing in Visio. In many ways, people don't really consider spelling and grammar checking in Visio to be a very important aspect of its use, because it's not like Word where you're typing in sentences and paragraphs and perhaps writing a whole report. You're doing drawings. The essence of the work that you're doing in Visio is the drawing. But given how important the text in drawings is, I think it's equally important to make sure that any spelling and grammar involved are correct. However, just a word of warning, in my experience, when it comes to labeling shapes, putting text on drawings and so on, it's very often the case that the way that you do that means that you are not using what might be called good, accurate grammar. So although I think spell checking is extremely important, sometimes grammar checking can be a bit of a hindrance because one does tend to use ungrammatical phrases when labeling a drawing. Having said that, if you want to run the grammar checker, that's up to you. If you'd like to know how to switch the grammar checker off, the page that I just showed you will tell you how to do that. But let's talk very specifically first about spell checking. When you're spell checking in Visio, as with the other components of Office, you really have two choices. You can spell check as you go, or you can spell check as a specific exercise at whatever point in time you choose to do that check. Let me show you what it looks like to check as we go. I've added a rectangle here. I'm going to type some text into it. Now to make this a little bit easier to see, I'm going to increase the point size. Let me start typing. Now at this point, Visio suspects that I've misspelt this word, and it gives me that squiggly line underneath the word to indicate what it perceives to be a spelling mistake. That may or may not be a mistake. I might have entered a word that Visio has never heard of before, but which is not only a valid word but correctly spelt as well. But the key point here is that it's flagging the errors as I type. Some people like that and some people don't like that. So one of the options you have is whether or not you show or hide errors as you type. So if I go into Visio options, on the proofing page, one of the options there, the second checkbox from the bottom, check spelling as you type. Let me uncheck that for a moment. Now if I type that error, I don't get a squiggly line indicating that there's a problem. Some people find those squiggly lines distracting, and what often happens is that, particularly if you're working on a very technical drawing, you are entering so many words that fail the spell checker that it becomes a bit annoying. You're going to tell Visio about these words later, but at the moment it's just annoying you by flagging them all as being spelling errors. So that's one option you have. Do you want to see those errors flagged as you go or not? Now let's suppose that you choose the option of not showing the errors as you type. You can at any point while you're working on the drawing and the shapes go to the Review tab, and one of the options, the leftmost one in the proofing group, is to check spelling. So click on spelling, and what happens there is that Visio flags the error. It says not in dictionary rectangle, and it will make a list of words that it suggests may be the ones that you intended to type. In this case it's a very short list because it's decided that the most likely thing is the word rectangle, and at that point you can say, well, this isn't an error at all, I actually meant to put rectangle. You can say ignore that, or you can say add, which means this is a word and I want you to add it to my dictionary of valid words. Or, having typed in the change box the correct spelling, which defaults to the first suggestion that Visio has found, in this case the correct word rectangle, I want you to change it. And if you may have made that same spelling mistake elsewhere within this document, you can actually click on change all, and it will change all instances of rectangle to rectangle. On this case it's the only word that I've typed, so it must be the only occurrence of this error, so I click on change and the word is corrected. Now note, spelling. Visio finished checking the selection. Do you want to continue checking the remainder of the document? If you've made a selection, in this case I'm working in just that one shape, once it's corrected any spelling errors there, or more precisely once you run a spell check on that selection, it gives you the option of going through the rest of the document and looking for spelling errors. And obviously on this occasion there's no point in doing that because there isn't anything else in this document, but if I were working on a bigger document that would be a good option. So on this occasion I'm going to say yes, even though there's nothing to do, and eventually it says the spelling check is complete and my error is corrected. So given the option of checking spelling as you go or of running the spell checker, I have a drawing here with 3 shapes in it. Each shape has some text with a spelling error. If I go to the Review tab again and click on spelling, note that I don't have any shape selected. I'm not working on a shape. There's nothing selected. So in this situation what Visio will do will be to spell check the whole document. So I'm going to click on spelling. There is its first perceived error, the same one that we had before. I don't have to accept its suggestion. If I wanted to type my own word in the change to box, I could click on change, and that's exactly what Visio would do. On this occasion that is the correct correction, to change it to rectangle. Now with the next one there are 5 or 6 things that it could be. It could be eclipse or elapse or elish, whatever that is, but it's actually ellipse. It's this one that I want, so in that case I select the 4th one. That now occupies the change to box and I do a change on that. And the final one, again, there are 3 options and it's actually the 3rd one, so I select the 3rd one, click on change, and the spelling check is complete. So that's how to do a full spell check. The last feature that I want to demonstrate here is AutoCorrect. And you can use AutoCorrect to achieve a few things. You can correct common spelling mistakes that you might make, which might virtually be typing mistakes, but I'll demonstrate that in just a moment. And you can also use AutoCorrect as a way of, for example, inserting special characters into your drawings. Let me take a specific example. Let's suppose that one of the things that I very often do is to type 2 capitals at the beginning of a word. And I'd like Visio 2016 to correct that for me. I also need to put a copyright symbol onto one of these shapes. So what I'm going to do is to go down to the freeform shape text. But when I type freeform, I'm going to accidentally type the first 2 characters uppercase. Now if I go to the options, proofing page again, one of the options there is AutoCorrect options. And one of the corrections I can do is to correct 2 initial capitals. It's a mistake that a surprisingly large number of people make. Probably they just don't let go of the shift key quickly enough when they're typing. And then if you look further down this same page, AutoCorrect tab in the AutoCorrect options, there are some key sequences that can be used to put in special characters. So for instance, if I want an international copyright symbol, I type round bracket, letter C, right round bracket. If I wanted a euro symbol, left round bracket, E, right round bracket, and so on. So I'm going to demonstrate getting a copyright symbol and correcting 2 initial capitals. So let me type freeform first. Now when I type the space character here, Visio will realize that I've got to the end of that word and it will correct that double initial capital. And to get the copyright symbol, it's left C, right, again press the space, I've got a copyright symbol. So that's a couple of uses of AutoCorrect as well. That's it for this section. I'll see you in the next one. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Visio 2016. In this section I'm going to look at pan and zoom. Many aspects of zoom you've seen already and I won't be repeating those, but I'm going to add 2 or 3 new zoom features that you may find very useful, particularly now that your skills in Visio have considerably increased. So first of all we're going to look at why we need pan and zoom. Then I'm going to look at those additional zoom features, and finally I'll demonstrate the pan and zoom window. So why do we need pan and zoom? Whatever size of diagram you're dealing with, it's very often the case that, particularly if it's a very technical diagram with a lot of detail, you need to get close to the detail. You need to be able to work at a very fine level of detail. And of course, if you're dealing with a diagram which is actually very large, either large in itself or that representing a very expansive subject, you may need to zoom in order to even recognize or identify the part of the drawing that you need to work on. Now, one of the problems you get here is if you've zoomed into a very large diagram and then you need to see a different part of the same diagram, there is a tendency to zoom right out again and zoom back in again to get to the bit that you want, which may be, say, completely at the other end of the diagram. One way you can avoid this zooming out and zooming in and efficiently get yourself to a completely different part of the diagram is to use the pan feature. Now I'm going to demonstrate panning later on in this section, but one of the things about panning in particular is that it's actually a little bit tricky to do at first until you get a bit of a feel for it. But as you develop a feel for it, the use of pan, and in particular the use of the pan and zoom window, will make it much easier for you to find your way around particularly large drawings. For the purposes of this section, I'm going to create course file 11 with 6 or 7 assorted basic shapes in it. I'll do that now, and just join me in just a moment. So we've already looked at how to zoom in and out, and once you're zoomed in, of course, you can use the scroll bars at the side to pan around. I'll come back to panning in just a moment. But on the subject of zooming, you may have found it quite frustrating sometimes to zoom to exactly the place that you want to zoom to. So I'm going to show you a couple of useful techniques for that. One of them is what we generally refer to as zoom to selection. Let's suppose that I want to zoom in and I want to work on the triangle and the square in the bottom left hand corner of course file 11. If I hold down the Control and Shift keys on my keyboard, the cursor becomes a plus sign, and if I now draw a rectangle around the two shapes that I want to zoom into and then release the mouse button, I zoom in to those two shapes. Anything else that happens to be in the way will be there as well, of course, but I can draw that on any part of the drawing in order to zoom in. And of course I could use it again if I wanted to. Control Shift again. I might just now draw around the triangle, and now I'm zoomed into just the triangle. Whenever you're zoomed in, if you want to go back to seeing the whole drawing again, one of the very most important keyboard shortcuts is Control, Shift and W. That takes you back to seeing the whole page again. Another very useful zoom feature is zooming using the scroll wheel on your mouse, if indeed you have a scroll wheel on your mouse. If you do, hold the Control key down on the keyboard, operate the mouse in the usual way, the scroll wheel, and you'll find that you're zooming. And yet another feature, if you go into the Advanced page in Visio Options, about the 7th option down in the editing options, center selection on zoom. Mine is currently not checked. Some people like this, some people don't. I'm going to check it now and watch what happens. If I select any shape, let's say I select that diamond at the top there, and I'm going to zoom with my scroll wheel on my mouse, so I'm holding the Control key down, I'm going to start to zoom. And what happens is, however I zoom, that the diamond is centered in the drawing window. That can be useful. Some people like it, some people don't. I generally don't use that, so I'm going to uncheck that option now. Now let's take a look at the pan and zoom window. There are a few ways of accessing this. If you right click on the status bar, make sure that pan and zoom window is checked. Then you'll have a button, two from the right, pan and zoom window. If I click on pan and zoom window, it opens on the left, and I'll explain the use of the window in just a moment. But an alternative way of opening it is up on the View tab under Task Panes. It's one of the options there. You note it's currently marked as enabled. You could disable it like that, or of course enable it like that. And what the pan and zoom window does for you is to give you a picture of the whole of your page, or whichever part of it you choose to look at. So let's suppose I'm going to work on this circle, and I'm zooming in on the circle, so let me just zoom in a bit on there. And what I can see, what's visible in the drawing window, is represented in the pan and zoom window by that blue rectangle. And I can manipulate the view, what I see in the drawing window that is, either by moving around the drawing window, so I could use the scroll bars for instance. Watch what happens as I scroll left and right. Look at what's being shown in the pan and zoom as well, and as I scroll up and down, watch what's happening there as I scroll up and down. And if I wanted to go to a particular part of the drawing, so I've been working on the circle and now I want to go to the triangle, rather than having to use the scroll bars as I was just demonstrating, I could go over to the pan and zoom window and click on the triangle, and that takes me directly to the triangle. And that's one of the great ways that the pan and zoom window can help you to move around and work on a large or complex drawing. And in addition to the features that I've just shown you, let me just make the left-hand panel there a little bit bigger. You can also vary the part of the drawing that's visible in the drawing window by moving the blue box in the pan and zoom window. And it's relatively easy to position it wherever in the drawing you want to position it. And you can also vary the size to increase or decrease the part of the drawing that's viewable in the drawing window. And there's also a zoom slider on the pan and zoom window itself. So plenty of options there for moving around your drawing. And finally, as far as pan and zoom's concerned, if you right click on the pan and zoom window header, one of the options is float window, and it becomes a floating window, and you can put it elsewhere in your workspace if that's more convenient. When you've finished using the pan and zoom window, you can either control its visibility using one of the mechanisms you use to show it, or you can just press the close button on the pan and zoom window itself. That's the end of this section. I'll see you in the next one. Hello again and welcome back to our course in Visio 2016. In this section I'm going to cover a couple of very important topics related to the Visio workspace. Now, if you've used a relatively recent version of Visio, you probably don't need to cover this section, although I will also be covering collapsing the ribbon. So if you're not sure about that, I suggest that you do follow this short section anyway. So first of all, we're going to look at what I'm going to call the Visio saved workspace, and then we're going to look at collapsing the ribbon. So first of all, let's look at saving a workspace, which is something that Visio does for us automatically when we save and close a file or when we close Visio itself. In the case of course file 11 that I'm looking at here, I have the shapes windows open. I've got the basic shapes stencil selected, and the workspace comprises the quick access toolbar and ribbon at the top. Then I've got that shapes window. I've got the drawing itself in the drawing window. Note that the ruler is shown. And of course I've got the status bar at the bottom. And together they comprise what we call the workspace. Now I may have, of course, additional windows open as well, such as size and position. But given that I'm working on this at a particular time, note the zoom level is currently 90%. If I close this and reopen it, some aspects of the workspace as it is now go with the drawing, and I'll get those back when I open the drawing again, and some of them don't. So remember what I've got there for course file 11. Let me save and close. Now the other drawing I've got open here is my answer to exercise 3. Note again that the shapes window is open on the left, but I've got computers and monitors as the selected stencil. What I'm going to do is to minimize the shapes window here. I'm going to change the zoom level for the drawing. I'm going to zoom right in 200% for the drawing. And I'm going to open the size and position window. Now I'm going to save and close this drawing. Now watch what happens if I open now course file 11. Now course file 11 opens with a zoom level of 90%, which is how I saved it, but it opens with the shapes window minimized and with the size and position window visible. So they were, if you like, the installation settings, I'll call them, when I last worked on a drawing. So when I open course file 11, it partly gets its own setting, which is the zoom level on the drawing, and partly gets the workspace settings as they were when I last closed something. Now let me expand the shapes window again. Let me close size and position window. Let me open the pan and zoom window. I've not done anything to the drawing itself, so I'm going to save and close that. Now watch what happens when I open exercise 3 again. Exercise 3 is still zoomed in to that 200% zoom level. In fact, it's gone to 201, but I don't think we'll quibble over that tiny bit. And it's still got the computers and monitors stencil open, but the shapes window has opened and the pan and zoom window is open. So some aspects of the workspace are saved, if you like, they're specific to the drawing, and some of them are specific to, if you like, how I left my workspace last time I was working on any drawing. Now you'll soon get used to which is which, but it's important to be aware of that difference. The second item related to the workspace that I'd like to cover in this section is collapsing the ribbon. If you are using a device with a relatively small screen, or if you're dealing with particularly large and complex drawings, you sometimes need to give yourself as much working space as you possibly can. And one way that you can gain quite a bit of working space is to collapse the ribbon. Now, collapsing the ribbon is very straightforward. If you look towards the right hand end of the ribbon, there's a little up pointing arrow, and all you need to do is tick that, collapse the ribbon, and now you can no longer see it. The most obvious problem with that is you can't any longer see the commands that you need to use to work on your drawing. But generally speaking, people collapse the ribbon when they've been using Visio for a while, and they tend to know where the commands that they need are. So for instance, let's suppose that I've collapsed the ribbon, and what I want to do is to change the color of this circle. Now, if I know where the command is to fill that, so I'm just going to go to the Home tab, and I know that there's a fill button there, and I can change the fill color. Then having filled with that color, when I've finished and click away, the ribbon disappears again. Now, if I don't know where a command is that I need, let's suppose that I've forgotten how to do shape replacement and I can't remember where it is. I know it's on the mini toolbar, by the way. I select this shape and I think, now where's shape replacement? All I need to do is to click on any tab name, and I can work my way along the tabs, and I can say, now where's that one that I want? And then, oh, there it is, change shape. I want to change that for that shape, that's fine. And then when I've done it, click away again, the ribbon's disappeared again. So it's extremely straightforward to do. You can still view the commands just by clicking on the tabs, and as soon as you finish using a particular command, the ribbon collapses again and you're back to having as much space as possible. If you open the ribbon at any time, right click in this space on the right. Note that collapse the ribbon is checked. If I uncheck it, then it's fully open again, and it will stay open with all the tab contents visible to me. That's collapsing the ribbon. That's the end of this section. I'll see you in the next one. Hello again, and welcome back to our course on Visio 2016. In this section, I want to look at a few of the automation features in Visio 2016. These features can help you to work very quickly, particularly with some types of drawing and in some situations. First of all, I'm going to demonstrate AutoConnect, then AutoAdd, and then AutoDelete. I should point out that whether or not these things work and how they work will to some extent depend on one or two Visio options that we're going to look at as we work through this section as well. Course file 12 will be a part of a network diagram, and I'm going to start by demonstrating AutoConnect. First thing to do is to go into the Visio options, and then on the advanced page, the fourth option down in editing options is enable AutoConnect. So first of all, you're going to need AutoConnect enabled. And the other thing you need to check is on the View tab. In the Visual Aids group, there is an AutoConnect checkbox. Even if you generally use AutoConnect, there may be specific instances where you don't want to use it, and you may find it helpful to uncheck it there just for, say, a particular drawing or for a particular sequence, a particular period of time. So AutoConnect is enabled for me, and the first thing I'm going to do is to add a router to my network diagram. There it is. Let me just click away. Now, when I come to adding the next component to my network diagram, one thing you may well have noticed is that if I hover over a shape, I'll often get some little blue wedges. Watch what happens when I hover over the router. And this has 4 little blue wedges, and these are the little AutoConnect icons. And if I wanted to AutoConnect to add and automatically connect another shape to the drawing. Let's suppose I'm going to go to the icon at the top there. If I hover over that, I am shown 4 icons, and those icons correspond to the first 4 of my quick shapes for this particular stencil. So if you look over at the network and peripherals stencil on the left, you can see there the first 4 icons. So if what I needed in the diagram here was a server, for example, all I need to do is click on server, and not only is the server added to the diagram, but the connector is added as well. So that gives you a really quick way of adding one of your quick shapes to a drawing, complete with connector. And that's basically what AutoConnect does. Now there are a couple of other things to point out in relation to this. If I hover over the router again, note that I now only get 3 of those AutoConnect wedges. They're normally referred to as the AutoConnect arrows. I only get 3 arrows because I don't get one where there is already another shape connected. And the other thing to point out is that I'm not restricted to choosing from the quick shapes. Let's suppose that what I wanted to add next to this diagram is a switch. If I select switch in the stencil first and then go over here, choose my AutoConnect arrow and click on that, what I will get will be a switch. So similarly here, computers and monitors. If I were to say select PC, go back here, click on the AutoConnect arrow, and I've now got a PC. And the other thing to bear in mind, if I just go back to network and peripherals again, the little mini toolbar with the quick shapes on it only shows the top 4. Well, I did show you earlier on in the course how to change the order of those quick shapes if you need to make sure that the top 4 are the top 4 that you want. And just one other final thing to show you. Let's suppose that I already have a shape in a drawing which is not connected to another shape. Let me go back to the switch again here. Note now I only have one AutoConnect arrow. If I click on that arrow and drag it to the scanner, it will be connected anyway using a conventional connector as well. So that's AutoConnect. For AutoAdd, I'm going to use a different type of diagram. I'm going to use a flowchart. Most people have seen flowcharts. You may use them quite a bit yourself. We are going to look at flowcharts in quite a bit of detail later on because they're very useful for demonstrating some very important features, including the one I'm going to demonstrate here. So I'm starting from scratch with course file 13. I've got the basic flowchart shapes stencil here. I'm going to drag a start end up there, and I'm going to use AutoConnect and get a process box, and then again process box, and maybe it's a very simple flowchart, this one. Let's have an end there. So that's a pretty straightforward flowchart. No idea what it does. If I decided that I needed to introduce an additional process box, for example, between the middle 2, in theory what I would need to do is to delete the connector between them, put the new process box in there, possibly move the 2 below it a little to space things out more evenly, and then introduce 2 more connectors. But AutoAdd in Visio can do that job for me. So if I grab the process box from the stencil on the left and drag it between those 2, one thing to notice is that you see the connectors on the ends of that dynamic connector change to green squares. That means that AutoAdd is going to be used here. If I now release the mouse, there is my new process box in place and my 2 new connectors in place as well. So that can be a real time saver. Apart from getting rid of the old connector, replacing it with 2 new ones, and introducing the new process box, of course, what's happened there is that Visio has moved parts of the diagram around in order to accommodate the added shape. It generally tries to move things down and to the right. When it starts to run out of space, it can sometimes do some rather strange things. So you may need to intervene at that point and do a little bit of manual reorganization of your drawing. But as long as it's got space to work, it does a pretty good job. Now, the other automation feature that's very useful there, and which goes hand in hand with that, is AutoDelete. Let's suppose I wanted to get rid of this shape here. In theory, I'd need to delete the shape, delete the two connectors, and then put a new connector between the process box above it and the end box, but that's not necessary. All I need to do here, having selected the shape I wish to delete, is to hit the delete key. The shape is deleted and the two connectors are replaced by a single connector. Finally then, let me return to something I said near the beginning of this section. Beware of the Visio options that apply here. If I go back into options, the advanced page in the editing, one of the options there that I have checked is delete connectors when deleting shapes. That's a very important option because it means that when you delete a shape, you delete the associated connectors. And then the other important option here, enable connector splitting. If I disable that connector splitting, what happens now if I try to introduce a process box between the lower of the two process blocks that are already in the drawing and the end box? If I pull that over now, I don't get those green squares, and if I drop this here now, what will happen is the flowchart will just go round it because it doesn't realize that I'm doing an AutoAdd. Let me just undo that. Enable connector splitting again. Do that again, and of course now I'm back to my green squares. That's the end of this section. I'll see you in the next one. Welcome back to our course on Visio 2016. In this and the next couple of sections we're going to take a look at organisation charts, or org charts as I'll normally refer to them. Org charts have been part of Visio pretty much since it began, and many people use Visio to maintain their org charts. Not only because it's a very convenient way of drawing the charts, but also, as we'll see later on, if you need to maintain an org chart from data, say from some kind of HR personnel database, you can do that almost automatically with Visio. In this first section, I'm going to concentrate on manually creating an org chart. So first of all, I'll give you an introduction to org charts. Then we'll follow the manual option and create a straightforward example. I'll show you some of the time-saving tools and techniques that you can use, and then we'll look at layout issues with org charts. Although many of the things that we're going to cover in this and the next couple of sections do relate specifically to org charts, many of the tools and techniques can also be used more widely as well. And in particular, the linkage between a chart and saved data is a very important one. As the name implies, an organisation chart depicts an organisation, and very often organisation charts are used for things like management hierarchies. Perhaps where you work there may be an org chart on the wall with the boss at the top and his team under him, and then each member of his team is represented with the people that report to that person, and so on. Org charts, however, can be used for many other organisational purposes. For example, you may draw an org chart of your country's government, say starting from the presidency and down through the various departments of government, and that's a very common use for org charts. Many scientific and non-scientific structures can also be represented. So for instance, you could use an admittedly quite large org chart for the taxonomy of all of the animals in the world, or maybe some sort of bibliographic structure. In this and the next couple of sections, I'm going to concentrate on their use in management structures. And in this first section, I'm going to draw an org chart manually. In the next section, I'm going to use the org chart wizard. In the third section, I'm going to look particularly at styling org charts. In the last couple of releases of Visio, the improvements in org charts have been really steered in the direction of improvements to the styling and presentation of those charts. So let's get started on building an org chart. Go into File, New, And one of the templates there is organization chart. I'm going to work in metric units on this occasion. And what normally happens is that you'll see an organization chart wizard appear, and we're going to look at the wizard in the next section. So at this stage, let's just cancel out of that. Now, one of the first things to note is that on the ribbon there is now an org chart tab. So this particular template has its own tab, and within that tab there is a group, the shapes group. And if you hover over the first shape in the gallery there, you'll see the screen tip belt. Now, there are about 7 or 8 other alternative styles, so I could go for notch. And if I select notch, note that the stencil changes accordingly. One of the important things to note when you're working with org charts is that although you may make a decision about the style that you want when you create the chart first, you can easily change it later by selecting a different option here. Now, as I say, we're going to use belt style on this first example. So, as you can see, I've saved the drawing with the name orgchart01, and I'm now going to start to build the org chart. I'm starting at the top of the organization. This is a small software company. The Chief Executive Officer is going to be the first role in the chart. So I go to the executive belt, click and drag it to roughly the middle of the drawing. Note the name of the master there, executive belt. It's the executive shape, but it's using the belt org chart style. So if we chose an alternative style, such as the notch style, the equivalent master there is executive notch. Now, there are 2 text placeholders there. One for the title, and in this case that's CEO. And the second one is for the name, and the name of this CEO is Diane Dixon. So I'm just going to add those. And now I'm going to add one of the 3 managers that reports to the CEO. The manager I'm going to add is the technical director, whose name is Bryony Borelli. So I select the manager belt and I click and drag. In order to make sure that Bryony is shown in the chart as reporting to Diane, I drop Bryony's shape on top of Diane's. And what Visio 2016 does is to realize the relationship between the two. So it puts in basically a connector, a reports connector in there. And now I can type in the title and name for Bryony. So let me do that next. And that's the beginning of my org chart structure. Now I have 2 more managers who report to Diane. I'm going to add those in the same way. Join me again when I've done that. I've given myself the role of accounts director, so I'll be very good at looking after the money, I'm sure. And I'm going to have 1 person reporting to me. So I grab position, and there's my report. And in addition, in situations where you have a vacancy, then you have a vacancy master. Let me drag that over, drop that on top of me as well. You probably realize that those head and shoulders icons there are there to take photos, and we're going to be adding some pictures to org charts in a section or 2 from now. Where there is a vacancy, of course, there is no photo, so that explains the difference in the graphic for the position shape. Let me just put in the name and title of the person who reports to me. I've added Keith's details, and I've also indicated that the vacancy is for a senior accountant. One of the other masters is the assistant master, and in the case of this organization, the CEO, Diane, has an assistant. When you're representing a report, you always take the master for the person who is reporting and drop it onto the person that they report to. And in that way, the relative relationship is built correctly. In this case, you can see the indication here is that the CEO's assistant is not directly one of the people within the hierarchy, but someone, if you like, who within the structure is sort of at the side, a specific kind of role. A personal assistant, PA, personal secretary, that sort of thing. So let me put in the details of the CEO's PA. In terms of org charts, this is still a pretty straightforward chart. And as you'll know if you've looked at these before, there tend to be quite a few more sophisticated aspects. So for instance, there are things like a dotted line report, a team frame and a staff belt. But very often when a template is built to draw a specific type of drawing, the designer of the template will have included some shortcuts, some time-saving tools. And in the case of org charts, there are one or two that are really quite useful. You've just seen, for example, that when you're drawing this particular structure, Diane has 3 managers who report to her. You have to do the same thing 3 times. One of the masters that's available here is 3 positions. And let's suppose that Carl has 3 positions, 3 people that report to him. Let's go over and drop that onto Carl. And what happens is I automatically get 3 positions in place reporting to Carl. So let me once again add the roles and names for those people. And an even more sophisticated option is multiple shapes. If I take the multiple shapes master and drop it onto Bryony's shape, I'm asked a question. Add multiple shapes. What sort of shapes? Assistants, executives, managers? I'm going to say positions, and I'm going to say that 5 people report to Bryony. Click on OK, and there we are. Notice now that my org chart doesn't actually fit on one sheet of paper. It's spilt over onto a second sheet. But as you can see, that's a very quick way of adding multiple shapes to an org chart. Generally speaking, Visio does a pretty good job of laying out an org chart without too much manual intervention from you. But you do get situations like this one where you look at that and you say, well, I'm sure this could be fitted onto one page if a little bit more effort were put in. Well, there are 2 or 3 things you can try in this situation. If you look at the layout group on the org chart contextual tab, one of the options is re-layout. Now, many of these layout tools, I would suggest you leave until you're pretty much finished with at least a version of an org chart, because if you change the layout and then you've still got other shapes to add, the chances are you'll finish up doing this again anyway. But I pretty much put on this org chart what I'm going to put on it. I haven't put the titles and names for Bryony's reports on, but that won't make any difference to the content of the chart anyway. So let's try re-layout. Now in this case, you will notice that Visio made a change there, but it still didn't manage to get this down to one page. Now there are several other things you can try, and again, going back to the layout group, if you click on the arrow at the bottom of the layout button, you can try alternative layouts, what are described as horizontal, vertical, side by side, and so on. There is also a button here which quite often does a good job, best fit to page. Now in that case it still hasn't quite fitted it on one page. But another option you can try, if you look at the arrange group to the right of the layout group, there are some options there where you can increase or decrease the spacing between the shapes. Now clearly if I increase the spacing, that's going to make things worse, but if I decrease it, I might just be able to decrease it enough to get it onto one page, which I can't. And there are a few other things that you can try. So for instance, you could select Bryony and click on Show Hide Subordinates, and in that way Bryony's reports would be hidden. You just see a little symbol there to indicate there are subordinates, and as you'll see later you could make this into a multi-page org chart and show the structure under Bryony on a separate page. But ultimately, bear in mind that you have the option of sorting this out manually. So to do that, I could, for instance, drag Toby's shape over to here and Carl's shape over to here. And now what I'm going to do is to use a box to select all of those subordinate shapes And I'm going to use the width button here in the shapes group on the contextual tab, and I'm going to reduce the width of all of those subordinate shapes. Having done that, I'm going to select Bryony and her reports, and I'm going to use the layout button over on the left to change that to a horizontal layout. Now that doesn't quite fit, but if I select Bryony's shape, pull it down a little, her reports go with her, of course, and there we are. That's pretty neat looking now. I think that's not a bad attempt. It almost fits onto one page, so let me just pull that up to there, and that's it. We're on one page. That's the end of this section. I'll see you in the next one. Welcome back to our course on Visio 2016. In this section we're going to look at creating an organization chart using external data. First of all, I'll just discuss some of the options for external data. Then we'll look at the org chart data we're going to use in the example in this section, and this data is stored in an Excel workbook. We'll then look at using the org chart wizard using data from the workbook, and finally we'll look at an example of correcting an error. So the first thing to point out is that Visio can get data for org charts, and in fact for many other types of chart, from many different external sources. And I'm going to talk more about data, external data, and what we generally call shape data in a few sections from now. Many of the sources that it can get data from are really quite specialized. So you can get data from Microsoft Access databases, external ERP systems, enterprise resource planning systems, and so on. So when I was looking at what to demonstrate here, I tried to choose something which was as little specialized as possible. So I chose Microsoft Excel. Quite a lot of people use Microsoft Excel, and it's a relatively straightforward data source, but it's also sophisticated enough to support the kind of data structures that you're going to see in org charts. So here we have the content of the Visio 2016 Org Chart 02 Data Workbook. The name of the member of staff is in the first column, Diane Dixon, Peter Bogdanovich, and so on. The role they have is in the second column, and their manager is in the third column. I want you to ignore columns D and E. If you're not familiar with Microsoft Excel, if you don't use it and you're starting to feel a bit baffled already, don't worry. You only need those first three columns, the ones with the heading A, B and C, and they contain the information that you saw in the preceding section, but in a structured form. In order to make things relatively straightforward, Bryony has only two people reporting to her, Andy Clenham, who's the network manager, and Cecile Lombardo, who's the maintenance manager. Other than that, and they were not named in the previous section, the people in the org chart are the same people that were in the previous section. They have the same roles and should be reporting to the same managers. For one of those people, Peter Bogdanovich, we're going to see a little bit of a problem when we've made the org chart, but I'll also show you how to correct that problem as well. So that's the Excel workbook. It's in the course files folder if you aim to try this out yourself. Let's try that wizard now. So here's the organization chart wizard. I want to create my organization chart from information that's already stored in a file or database. That's the option I'm going to choose. Information that I enter using the wizard. One option that's available to me is to enter the information or the equivalent of the information you've just seen as I use the wizard. I suggest that when you've finished working through this section, You try that option out yourself. Now notice the options I have. A Microsoft Exchange server directory. If you have access to a Microsoft Exchange server, which is normally used to hold employee information, including email addresses and so on, you can use that option here. The third option, an ODBC compliant data source. So if you have information in something like an Access database or some other type of database, Microsoft SQL Server database, Oracle database, etc., anything that's ODBC compliant, you can use that here. The middle option, a text file, an org+.txt file or an Excel file, is the one we're going to use. So that's the second option. Next again. Now I need to locate the file. So what I'm going to do is to browse to my course files folder. And there's the file you're going to be using if you're working along with me. Visio 2016 org chart 02 data. Click on open. The language is English United States. Click on next. And what Visio does is to take a look at that workbook and the first sheet in that workbook, in the Excel workbook, and just try to figure out what the columns mean. So it looks at the data and tries to work out what the various columns mean. Choose the columns, fields in your data file that contain the information that defines the organization. So it thinks that the name is in the name column, which is correct. And in fact, if you take a look at the workbook separately, you'll see that's correct. They report to a manager, and yes, that's the correct column. The column was called manager. And if there's a first name column as well, which there isn't in this case, so note that's optional, you can check that it's picked up the correct first name option here as well. Now there was no first name column, so that optional field won't be included. Click on next. Now choose the columns, the fields that you want to display. Now the name field we know is already the name of the person, and Excel has correctly identified that, and that's going to be name there. Now the role field is the one that actually gives the job title, so we want to show that as well. But we don't want to show the manager because the manager's name will appear as their name in their own shape. And as I said earlier on, I want to ignore employee number and start date. So they're the only two that I want to show, name and role. Click on next. Choose the columns, fields from your data file that you want to add to organization chart shapes as shape data fields. Now I only want name and role. I don't want an employee number, so I'm going to remove that one. I could have it if I wanted it, but I'm going to remove it. Click on next. Now I have an option to import pictures. Now at this stage I can specify a folder that contains the pictures to include in the org chart. We're actually going to add pictures in the next section, so at the moment I'm going to say don't include pictures. If I did want to include them, I'd need to specify the folder, and I'd also need to specify which of the fields that's available is used to match the picture to the person. So for instance, I might need to put their employee number as the name of the picture and then include employee number in the org chart. Or I could perhaps just use their name and their picture would then need to include their name. But at this stage, as I say, I'm not going to include pictures, so I'm going to click on next. Your organization data may contain too many employees to fit on one page of your drawing. You can specify how much of your organization to display on each page, or you can let the wizard define each page automatically. Now it may be that if you have a very large number of shapes, it's definitely not going to fit on one page, and you can give the wizard rules about how to decide how much to put on each page. Now the default option here is the second option. The first option says I want to specify how much of my organization to display on each page. particularly if this is going to be quite a complex chart to draw and you really want it to appear as a multi-page chart, but with you being very specific about what goes on each page. You might want to use the first option. And in fact, again, you might want to try that yourself when you've worked through the example as I'm working through it here. We're going to go for the second option, which basically leaves it to Visio, and we'll see what Visio comes up with. Bear in mind that when you're using this wizard, because apart from checking boxes and making selections here, it's normally a pretty quick thing to do. If it all goes horribly wrong and it doesn't work, it's relatively straightforward to just go back to the start and try different options. So let's go for the automatically option, and the name at the top of the first page, top executive, that's going to be the person who's highest in the hierarchy. If I click on the drop down here, I could actually choose here, in our case, that Diane's going to go at the top, but I'm pretty sure that Visio is going to work that out for itself anyway, based on the management reporting hierarchy. Now, the two other things here, hyperlink employee shapes across pages and synchronize employee shapes across pages, we're going to look more at these later on, particularly when we're looking at multi-page drawings. But at the moment, we'll stick with the defaults of having both of those checked and click on Finish. Away it goes. And that's what it's come up with, which is pretty good actually. I think that very much reflects our hierarchy, but for the error of Peter Bogdanovich, which we're going to look at next. Now, this particular error in this org chart was caused whilst using the wizard. But an org chart produced by the wizard is just the same as any other org chart, and you might need to correct errors, you may need to make changes. Somebody in the org chart may get a promotion or start reporting to a different boss. So rather than have to continually redraw charts, it's useful to be able to make changes to them. And in this particular case, Peter, who's actually Diane's PA, if I select the shape for Peter and right click, on the contextual menu, one of the options is change position type. And if I change that to assistant, it appears that nothing has happened. But if I go up and click on Relayout in the Layout group on the Org Chart tab, Visio corrects the chart accordingly. So all I now need to do is to save this chart with an appropriate name in the Course Files folder. That's the end of this section. I'll see you in the next one. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Visio 2016. It's time now for exercise 4. And here is my answer to exercise 4. It's a very straightforward org chart, but a couple of little complications that might make you perhaps scratch your head a little bit. This org chart has been created from a text file, and I'll show you that text file in a moment. The names of the people in the organization are similar to the names that we've seen already, and the style of the org chart is what's called a coin style. So I'd like you to make sure that you use that style. Now, in building this, we're not using an Excel workbook, we're using a text file. So let's take a look at that text file next. So here is the text file. The first row in this text file, which is currently open in Notepad here, contains the names of the data fields. So we have name, role, manager, employee number and start date. It's not immediately apparent when you look at a text file in Notepad where the tab characters are, but those items, name, role, manager, employee number, start date, those 5 things are separated by tab characters. And this corresponds to the separators that are used within the data itself. So in the case of Diane Dixon, her name is Diane Dixon, then there's a tab, then there's CEO, which is her role, her job title, another tab, then her manager, which is empty because she's the top of the tree, she doesn't have a manager, then another tab, then her employee number, EMP00147, then another tab, and then her start date, 9/8/2011. And the other 4 people in this org chart have data which is structured in the same way. Now, when you come to use the org chart wizard and read this text data, you should find that everything defaults to accepting this particular text file with these tab separators without you having to do very much at all. So if you pretty much go for defaults throughout, you should find that this works pretty well. Now, one thing I'd like to draw your attention to here is the employee numbers. For instance, Diane's is EMP00147, Bryony's is EMP00119, etc. And let's look at the significance of those next. Now, when you come to use the org chart wizard, when you get to the part that asks if you want to include photos or pictures, this time you're going to say yes. It will ask you where those pictures are, and then it will ask you how you associate a picture with a person in the org chart. And the way you do it is using the employee number. And within the exercise files folder, there are 5 files. They are PNG files, they're graphics files. PNG stands for Portable Network Graphics. They are PNG files, and there's one file for each of the people, and it's matched to the person using the employee number. Now, when you get to that part of using the wizard, all you need to make sure you're saying is that it's the employee number that is used to match the name of the file. So by default, Visio won't be too worried about the file extension, the .png bit. It can work that out for itself because it will look for something which is a suitable graphics file, PNG file, JPG file, that sort of thing. It'll find a PNG file, it'll be happy with that. What it needs to be told by you is that it's the employee ID, the employee number, that you match the pictures to the people with. And the other thing you need to be aware of in order to make this work is that when you get to the relevant point in the wizard and it asks you which fields you need to show on the org chart, and you say the role and the name, which is fine, it will also ask you which shape data you need to carry over. That's a subsequent page in the wizard. You need to make sure that you include the employee ID, the employee number, in the shape data, otherwise it won't be able to match them. You won't be showing the employee number on the org chart itself. This is sort of hidden data, if you like, but it will be there hidden within the org chart, and that's the way that Visio will match the person to the picture in each case. So that's one of the things that makes this a slightly tricky exercise to do, but we are coming to shape data soon in the course, and that will help to explain a little bit more about how shape data works in Visio 2016.
If you're not a subscriber, click down below to subscribe so you get notified about similar videos we upload. To get the course exercise files and follow along with this video, click over there. And click over there to watch more videos on YouTube from Simon Says It.